Cherry blossoms drifted like pink snow across the courtyard of the Maida family estate, settling gently on the carefully raked gravel and ornamental ponds. The wedding celebration was in full bloom, much like the spring gardens surrounding the grand house. Servants hurried between guest clusters carrying trays of sake and delicate confections, while musicians played traditional melodies that floated across the gathering like the petals themselves. Amid the swirling celebration, Mizuki sat alone. She had positioned herself at the edge of the courtyard, beneath the sheltering branches of a maple tree just beginning to unfurl its leaves. From this vantage point, she could observe the entire gathering while remaining largely unobserved herself, precisely as she preferred. Her formal kimono, a subdued pattern of indigo waves against a slate background, further aided her attempt at invisibility among the more brightly adorned guests. This seclusion was not mere shyness. Mizuki's presence at the wedding was itself a complicated matter. As the former lady-in-waiting to the bride's older sister, who had died the previous autumn of a wasting illness, Mizuki occupied an awkward position in the social hierarchy of the celebration. Too high-ranking to be seated with servants, too lowly to join the family's inner circle, and connected to a loss that no one wished to remember on such a joyous day. So she sat alone, balancing a cup of sake that had grown warm in her hands, watching as Akiko Maeda, radiant in layered kimono of crimson and gold, was officially welcomed into the powerful Ishikawa family through marriage to their second son, Noboru. "The bride is lovely, is she not?" said a male voice, startling Mizuki from her thoughts. She looked up to see a tall figure standing beside her bench, a samurai, judging by the two swords at his hip and his formal attire. He was perhaps 30, with features that suggested both authority and humor in equal measure. A thin scar traced a path from his right temple to the edge of his jaw, the only imperfection in an otherwise handsome face. "Yes, Akiko-san is beautiful today," Mizuki answered carefully, wondering why this unfamiliar warrior had chosen to address her. "Forgive my intrusion," he said, seeming to read her thoughts. "I am Takashi Kuroda, retainer to Lord Ishikawa." He bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that surprised her given the difference in their stations. "Mizuki Tanaka," she replied with a deeper bow of her own. "I served Akiko-san's sister before her passing." A look of understanding crossed Takashi's face. "Ah, that explains why you sit alone at what should be a joyful celebration." His directness caught her off guard. Most guests had politely pretended not to notice her isolation, while a few had actively avoided her, as if her association with death might somehow taint the wedding's auspicious beginnings. "It is appropriate," she said simply. "My presence is a courtesy extended by the Maeda family, nothing more." Takashi studied her with unexpected intensity. Appropriate, perhaps, but unnecessarily cruel. To invite you and then leave you to sit alone with memories. That serves neither you nor those who might benefit from your company. Before Mizuki could formulate a response to this surprising observation, a commotion near the main house drew their attention. Lord Ishikawa, the groom's father, was engaged in animated conversation with several retainers who had just arrived. Their dust-covered appearance and urgent manner suggested they brought news of significance. "Ah," Takashi murmured, "it seems my brief respite from duty has ended." He turned back to Mizuki, decision forming in his expression. "Would you do me the honor of accompanying me? I suspect I'm about to be given a task, and having you beside me would." He hesitated, then continued with a small smile. "Pretend like you're with me, and neither of us will have to be alone in this crowd." Mizuki blinked in surprise at the directness of his request. "I don't understand. Why would you want—" "Political complications are developing that I'd rather not navigate alone," he interrupted, offering his hand. And you look like someone who observes more than she reveals, a valuable quality at a gathering where sake has loosened many tongues. Will you help me?" Perhaps it was the unexpectedness of the request, or simply the prospect of purpose after hours of isolated observation, but Mizuki found herself nodding. She set aside her sake cup and rose, smoothing the folds of her kimono. "What should I do?" she asked. "Simply stay beside me and listen," Takashi replied, guiding her toward the center of the gathering. "If anyone asks, you are my companion for the day, recently arrived from Edo, where you served in the household of my distant cousin." "That's a rather elaborate deception," Mizuki observed quietly. "The best ones always are," he replied with a hint of a smile. "They contain just enough truth to be believable." Before she could question this cryptic response, they had reached Lord Ishikawa's circle. The noble was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a carefully trimmed beard and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. He was currently listening to the breathless report of a retainer who had clearly ridden hard to reach the celebration. "Crossed the northern border 3 days ago," the messenger was saying. "Lord Takeda claims the disputed lands were promised to his grandfather and has brought forces to reclaim them." Lord Ishikawa's expression darkened. "How many?" "Reports suggest 500 mounted samurai and perhaps twice that many Ashigaru." A murmur ran through the assembled listeners. Such a force was significant, not enough for a full-scale invasion of Ishikawa territory, but certainly sufficient to seize the contested northern border regions that had been a source of tension between the clans for generations. "And they choose today, of all days," Lord Ishikawa said grimly. He glanced toward the wedding pavilion where his son sat with his new bride, still unaware of the developing crisis. "Takeda knows we are vulnerable during celebrations. This is deliberately timed." His gaze swept the circle of retainers and landed on Takashi. "Kuroda, you know those northern territories better than most. What forces do we currently have stationed at Tsuruoka Castle?" 200 samurai and perhaps 300 Ashigaru, my lord," Takashi replied, without hesitation, "with Captain Yamamoto commanding. Not enough to repel Takeda's advance." Lord Ishikawa frowned thoughtfully. "Yet if we withdraw forces from our other borders to address this threat, we invite opportunistic incursions elsewhere," Takashi finished, "particularly from the Abe clan to the west, who have been unusually active in recent months." Lord Ishikawa nodded grimly. "Precisely. It seems Takeda has chosen his moment well." He turned back to the messenger. "When did you depart Tsuruoka?" 2 days ago, my lord. Captain Yamamoto had just received word of Takeda's approach and was preparing defenses, but he feared they would be overwhelmed without reinforcement." Throughout this exchange, Mizuki had stood quietly beside Takashi, absorbing the rapidly unfolding situation. Now, almost without thinking, she spoke. "Forgive my intrusion, but might I ask if Lord Takeda himself leads these forces?" All eyes turned to her, and Mizuki immediately regretted her impulsive question. Lord Ishikawa regarded her with a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "And who might you be to inquire about military matters?" he asked coolly. Takashi stepped slightly forward. "My lord, this is Mizuki Tanaka, recently arrived from Edo, where she served in my cousin's household. She has a particular talent for understanding political nuances." Lord Ishikawa's expression remained skeptical, but the messenger answered her question directly. "No, my lady. Lord Takeda remains at his castle. His second son, Nobuhide, leads the forces." A subtle tension that Mizuki hadn't realized she was holding released at this information. "Then, this may not be the crisis it first appears," she said quietly. "Explain," Lord Ishikawa commanded, his full attention now fixed on her. Mizuki chose her words carefully, aware she was speaking well beyond her station. Nobuhide Takeda is known for his ambition and impatience. If his father had truly decided to provoke open conflict with the Ishikawa clan, he would have sent his eldest son, Nobumasa, who is both more capable and more trusted. Dispatching Nobuhide suggests this may be an authorized demonstration rather than a sanctioned invasion. A thoughtful silence followed her analysis. Lord Ishikawa studied her with new interest. "You seem unusually well informed about Takeda family dynamics for a lady-in-waiting," he observed. "I served Lady Maida for 5 years," Mizuki replied with appropriate deference. She took an interest in the political landscape affecting her family's alliances and often discussed such matters in my presence. This was true enough, though it omitted the fact that Mizuki had been the one to gather much of that intelligence through her own network of connections among servants and merchants who traveled between the great houses. Lord Ishikawa turned to the messenger. "What banner did Nobuhide fly as he crossed our borders?" "His personal standard, my lord, not the main Takeda battle flag." "As I suspected," Mizuki murmured, then fell silent, realizing she had again spoken out of turn, but Lord Ishikawa nodded slowly. "Your companion has insight, Kuroda. If this is indeed Nobuhide acting with limited authority from his father, our response requires more subtlety than merely rushing troops to the border." He turned back to the circle of retainers. "Hirata, Matsuda, prepare to depart with a company of 50 samurai. You will reinforce Tsuruoka, but only to demonstrate our awareness of the situation. Avoid direct confrontation unless attacked first." He then addressed Takashi directly. "Kuroda, I have a different task for you. Ride to Takeda Castle under banner of diplomatic envoy. Speak directly with Lord Takeda about his son's actions. Determine whether this is truly sanctioned aggression or merely an ambitious young man's overreach." Takashi bowed deeply. "When would you have me depart, my lord?" "At dawn tomorrow. This wedding celebration must continue without alarming our guests or insulting our new in-laws with a precipitous departure." Lord Ishikawa's gaze flickered briefly to Mizuki. "Bring your politically insightful companion. A woman's presence may help convince Lord Takeda of your peaceful intentions, and she clearly has understanding. That may prove useful." Mizuki felt a jolt of surprise. To be included in such a mission was unprecedented for someone of her position. "My lord, she began, but Lord Ishikawa was already turning away, issuing further instructions to his other retainers. When the group dispersed, Takashi guided Mizuki to a quieter corner of the garden. His expression was apologetic, but also faintly amused. "I seem to have entangled you in matters far beyond our initial pretense," he said. "For that I apologize." Mizuki regarded him with growing suspicion. "Was this your intention all along? To use me somehow in this political situation?" He hesitated, just long enough to confirm her suspicions before answering. "Not precisely. I knew of your service to Lady Haru Maeda and had heard you possessed unusual perception. When I saw you sitting alone, I thought you might welcome purpose rather than isolation. The arrival of the messenger and your subsequent insights were fortunate coincidences." "Fortunate for whom?" Mizuki asked, unable to keep a note of bitterness from her voice. "I have no desire to involve myself in clan disputes or diplomatic missions. After Lady Haru's death, I had hoped only for a quiet position in a peaceful household." Takashi's expression softened. "And yet you immediately recognized the significance of which Takeda's son led the border incursion. You understand the currents of power that flow between the great houses." He leaned slightly closer. "Such talents wither when unused, Mizuki-san." The casual use of her name startled her almost as much as the perception behind his words. It was true that since Lady Haru's death, Mizuki had felt increasingly adrift. The quiet position she claimed to desire had begun to feel more like a slow disappearance. "I have no authority to refuse Lord Ishikawa's command," she said finally. "No," Takashi agreed, "but you might consider whether this unexpected turn of events offers something you need more than safety or predictability." Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of the bride and groom, making ceremonial rounds to thank their guests. Akiko, resplendent in her wedding finery, stopped short upon seeing Mizuki. "You came," she said, genuine warmth in her voice. "I wasn't sure you would." Mizuki bowed deeply. "I am honored by your invitation, Akiko-sama." "Please, no formalities between us today," Akiko insisted, taking Mizuki's hands in her own. "You were my sister's dearest companion. That makes you family in all the ways that matter." The simple kindness of this statement threatened to crack Mizuki's carefully maintained composure. She had loved Lady Haru deeply and had been devastated by her death, a pain compounded by her subsequent untethering from the household that had been her home for years. "Your sister would be delighted to see your happiness today," Mizuki managed, squeezing Akiko's hands gently. Noboru Ishikawa, the groom, observed this exchange with polite interest. He was a handsome man in his late 20s, with an intelligent gaze that suggested he was more than merely a political match for the Maeda daughter. "So you are the famous Mizuki," he said, with a respectful inclination of his head. "My wife has spoken often of your loyalty to her family." "You honor me with your attention," Mizuki replied, somewhat taken aback by the acknowledgement. Akiko's gaze moved between Mizuki and Takashi, a hint of pleased surprise in her expression. "I see you've met Takashi-san. He's one of the few members of my new family I already knew before the marriage arrangements. Our fathers were friends in their youth." This new information cast Takashi in a different light. If he had known Akiko before her marriage, he might well have known Lady Haru too, and by extension known of Mizuki's role in the Maeda household. "Kuroda-san has been kind enough to provide company during the celebration," Mizuki said carefully. "I'm glad," Akiko replied with evident sincerity. "Haru would have wanted you to find new connections, not remain isolated in her memory." She lowered her voice slightly. "I've worried about you, Mizuki. You've retreated so far into yourself since she died." Before Mizuki could formulate a response to this uncomfortable observation, a senior retainer approached to inform the bride and groom that they were needed for another ceremonial obligation. With promises to speak again before the celebration ended, Akiko and Noboru moved on to the next group of guests. Left alone again with Takashi, Mizuki turned to him with renewed suspicion. "You knew Lady Haru." "Not well," he admitted. "But I visited the Maeda estate several times over the years, due to my lord's alliance with their house. I observed you in your role there, always attentive, always gathering information, while appearing to do nothing more than attend to your lady's needs." "You make me sound like a spy," Mizuki said stiffly. "Not at all. A spy works against interests. You worked for them. Lady Haru was better informed and better protected because of your diligence." He regarded her thoughtfully. "When I recognized you sitting alone today, I wondered what had become of those skills since her passing." The conversation was interrupted yet again, this time by a servant informing Takashi that Lord Ishikawa requested his presence to discuss details of the upcoming mission. With a brief bow to Mizuki and a promise to find her later, Takashi followed the messenger back toward the main house. Left alone once more, Mizuki returned to her bench beneath the maple tree, her mind swirling with unexpected developments. The simple day of quiet observation she had anticipated had transformed into something far more complicated and potentially dangerous. A diplomatic mission to Takeda Castle, amid rising tensions between powerful clans, was no small matter. Yet beneath her apprehension, Mizuki felt something else stirring, a sense of purpose that had been absent since Lady Haru's death. For 5 years, she had devoted herself to serving her lady, not merely attending to physical needs, but providing intelligence, insight, and counsel. That role had given meaning to her days and direction to her considerable talents. Perhaps Takashi was right. Perhaps those abilities were withering from disuse in the months since she had become nothing more than a courtesy presence in the Maeda household. Retained out of respect for the deceased Lady Haru, but given no real function. As the afternoon progressed into evening, the wedding celebration became more boisterous. Sake flowed freely, musicians played livelier tunes, and even some of the more dignified guests joined in dancing. Throughout it all, Mizuki remained on the periphery, watching and listening as she had always done, but now with a different purpose. If she was to accompany Takashi on this diplomatic mission, she needed to gather as much current information as possible about the relationships between the houses involved. It was in this spirit that she found herself drifting closer to a conversation between 2 elderly women, the aunt of the groom and the grandmother of the bride, who had retired to a quiet corner with their sake cups. "Third border dispute in as many years," the aunt was saying. "My nephew may put on a brave face, but these Takeda provocations strain our resources." "Takeda has always been ambitious," the grandmother replied, her voice lowered, but still audible to Mizuki's carefully attuned ears. "But I wonder if this particular move might be less about territory and more about the wedding itself." "How so?" "Consider the timing. This wedding strengthens the alliance between Ishikawa and Maeda, which in turn creates a more formidable eastern neighbor for Takeda lands. Perhaps this border incursion is merely a reminder that they cannot be ignored in the new political landscape." The aunt nodded slowly, a show of strength rather than a true territorial grab. "Precisely, and one directed as much at the younger generation as the old. Nobuhide Takeda and Noboru have a history of competitive animosity. They were once rivals for a position in the governor's guard, were they not?" This piece of information was new to Mizuki and potentially significant. If there was personal enmity between Nobuhide Takeda and the groom, it added another dimension to the border dispute, one that might not be apparent to Lord Ishikawa or his advisors. She was so absorbed in this revelation that she failed to notice Takashi's approach until he spoke from just behind her. "Gathering intelligence already?" he asked quietly, amusement evident in his tone. Mizuki turned, embarrassed at being caught eavesdropping. "It's a habit difficult to break," she admitted, "and one that serves us well," he replied, guiding her away from the older women before they noticed her attention. "What did you learn?" She hesitated only briefly before sharing the information about the personal rivalry between Nobuhide and Noboru. Takashi listened with evident interest. "That adds a useful dimension to our understanding," he said when she finished. "If this provocation has a personal element rather than merely a political one, it may be easier to resolve without loss of face for either side. Assuming Lord Takeda himself isn't fully committed to the action," Mizuki cautioned. "Indeed, which is why our mission tomorrow is so crucial." Takashi glanced around the celebration, which showed no signs of winding down despite the late hour. "We depart at dawn. Do you have appropriate traveling clothes? The journey to Takeda Castle takes 3 days, and formal kimono would be most impractical." The practical question brought the reality of the situation into sharp focus. "I have simpler garments, yes," Mizuki replied, "though I never anticipated using them for a diplomatic mission." "Good. Pack lightly. We'll travel fast with a small escort." He studied her expression. You're concerned, wouldn't you be? Yesterday, I was a barely tolerated reminder of past loss. Today, I'm somehow involved in negotiations that could determine whether war erupts between great houses. Takashi's expression softened. I understand your apprehension. But consider this. For years, you used your considerable talents to serve Lady Haru and the Maeda family. Now you have an opportunity to serve a greater purpose, perhaps even prevent bloodshed. Put that way, it was difficult to maintain her resistance, and truthfully, beneath her stated concerns lay a more personal one she was reluctant to acknowledge. After months of emotional isolation following Lady Haru's death, the prospect of meaningful connection, even in dangerous circumstances, held undeniable appeal. "I'll be ready at dawn," she said finally. Takashi smiled, the expression transforming his serious features. "Good. Now, since we have but hours remaining before our departure, would you do me the honor of joining me for some refreshment? If we are to pretend to be companions, we might at least learn something of each other beyond titles and duties." The invitation was delivered lightly, but Mizuki sensed genuine interest beneath the practical justification. She found herself nodding agreement before she had fully considered the implications. They found a relatively quiet spot near one of the ornamental ponds, where paper lanterns reflected on the still water and the sounds of celebration were muted by distance. A servant brought fresh sake and small plates of delicacies from the wedding feast. "Tell me," Takashi said once they were settled, "how did a merchant's daughter come to serve as confidant to one of the Maeda princesses?" Mizuki nearly choked on her sake. "How did you know my father was a merchant? Your knowledge of distant provinces and their politics suggests someone who grew up hearing trade reports and market conditions discussed. Yet your mannerisms are those of someone educated alongside nobility. The logical conclusion, a successful merchant who ensured his daughter received education beyond what would be typical for her station. The assessment was so accurate it was almost unsettling. My father traded in silks and spices," Mizuki confirmed. "He believed knowledge was the most valuable commodity of all, so he employed tutors from Kyoto to educate me alongside my brothers." "And how did that education bring you to the Maeda household?" "My father supplied fine silks to the family. During one such delivery, I accompanied him and happened to be present when Lady Haru suffered one of her breathing attacks. I knew of an herbal remedy from my studies and—" She shrugged slightly. "She credited me with saving her life, though that was an exaggeration. Afterward, she requested me as a lady-in-waiting, and my father, seeing the advantage of such a connection, agreed. Despite separating from his daughter, he gained a valuable ally in a powerful house, and I gained opportunities no merchant's daughter could typically access." Mizuki sipped her sake. "It was a practical arrangement that evolved into genuine affection. Lady Haru was remarkable. Brilliant, kind, curious about everything beyond the confines of her sheltered existence. And she came to rely on you for more than just attendance to her physical needs," Takashi observed. Mizuki nodded, memories bringing both warmth and pain. She had a keen political mind, but limited access to information due to her illness and gender. I became her eyes and ears, gathering what she needed to advise her father on family matters. A valuable service, or it gave purpose to abilities that might otherwise have been wasted. Lady Haru understood that minds shouldn't be constrained by convention or circumstance. Mizuki looked up from her sake cup, meeting Takashi's gaze directly. "And you? How does a samurai come to have such unconventional views on a woman's potential usefulness beyond traditional roles?" He smiled at the directness of her question. "My mother was much like your Lady Haru, formally constrained by her position as a samurai's wife, but possessed of intelligence that couldn't be suppressed by mere social convention. She advised my father on everything from castle defences to alliance negotiations, though always from behind the screen, as propriety demanded. And he listened. He was wise enough to recognize wisdom, regardless of its source. Takashi refilled their cups. I learned early that talent and insight are too valuable to ignore based on arbitrary distinctions of gender or rank. It was a progressive viewpoint, rarely expressed so openly, especially by a man of his position. Mizuki found herself both impressed and slightly suspicious of such convenient alignment with her own experience. "And Lord Ishikawa shares these enlightened perspectives?" she asked, "given his willingness to include me in tomorrow's mission." "Lord Ishikawa is primarily pragmatic," Takashi replied with careful diplomacy. "If he believes you possess information or skills that serve his interests, he will utilize them regardless of conventional propriety. But do not mistake practical expedience for philosophical enlightenment." "I'm not naive," Mizuki said mildly. "I understand I'm a tool being employed for a specific purpose, not a respected equal in this venture. A tool with agency and insight is more than merely a tool," Takashi countered. "But yes, it would be wise to maintain realistic expectations regarding your position in tomorrow's proceedings." Their conversation continued as night deepened around the wedding celebration, ranging from diplomatic histories of the region's great houses to more personal subjects, though both carefully avoided revealing too much of their inner lives. It was a dance of gradual disclosure, each testing the other's trustworthiness and understanding. By the time they parted ways to prepare for the journey ahead, Mizuki felt she had gained a better measure of the man with whom she would be traveling. Takashi Kuroda was intelligent, observant, and seemingly genuine in his respect for her abilities. Yet she sensed layers beneath his affable exterior, complexities and perhaps vulnerabilities he kept carefully guarded. Much like herself, she realized. Perhaps that was why their pretense of companionship had felt less like a deception and more like a recognition as the evening progressed. Two people, accustomed to keeping their true thoughts hidden, finding unexpected common ground. Dawn arrived with the soft persistence of spring light filtering through morning mist. Mizuki had slept little, her mind occupied with preparations and contingency plans for the journey ahead. She dressed in simple but practical traveling clothes, a kosode of sturdy cotton in a subdued pattern of grey and blue, divided hakama for riding, and a straw hat to shield against sun and rain. A small pack contained spare garments, a writing kit, and the few personal items she couldn't bear to leave behind, including a delicate hairpin that had been Lady Haru's final gift to her. She arrived at the appointed meeting place in the outer courtyard to find Takashi already there, conferring with a small group of samurai who would serve as their escort. He too had exchanged formal attire for more practical traveling garb, though the quality of the materials and the swords at his hip clearly identified his rank. "Ah, Mizuki-san," he greeted her, breaking away from the group. "You're prompt, a quality I value greatly in traveling companions." "I dislike keeping others waiting," she replied simply. He nodded toward a bay mare being held by a groom nearby. "That mount is for you. I was told you can ride." "Yes, though it has been some time." In truth, Mizuki had learned horsemanship during her merchant family days, when she occasionally accompanied her father on shorter trading journeys. It was another unconventional skill for a woman of her background, but one that would serve her well in the days ahead. "Good, we have considerable ground to cover." He lowered his voice slightly. "Lord Ishikawa has emphasized the need for haste without sacrificing the appearance of proper diplomatic protocol, a delicate balance to maintain." Before they could discuss further details, the Lord himself appeared, accompanied by his son and new daughter-in-law. Despite the early hour and presumably limited sleep, all three were immaculately attired, a reminder that appearance and propriety remained paramount even in times of potential crisis. Lord Ishikawa addressed Takashi first, providing final instructions regarding the diplomatic approach to be taken with Lord Takeda. The conversation was detailed and specific, suggesting that the older man placed significant trust in Takashi's judgment and abilities. Then, somewhat to Mizuki's surprise, he turned his attention to her. "Tanaka-san," he said, his tone formal but not unkind, "my son has informed me of your service to the Maeda family, particularly your role in gathering and interpreting information that affected their political decisions." Mizuki bowed deeply, unsure how to respond to this direct acknowledgement. "Your insights regarding Nobuhide Takeda's motives yesterday were perceptive," Lord Ishikawa continued. "I expect you to apply similar discernment during this mission. Observe carefully, particularly in settings where samurai might not be present. The women's quarters, servants' conversations, merchants who supply the castle. Information gathered from such sources can be as valuable as formal diplomatic exchanges." "I understand, my lord," Mizuki replied, both honored and slightly alarmed by the explicit espionage role being assigned to her. Akiko stepped forward then, taking Mizuki's hands in her own, as she had during the wedding celebration. "Please be careful," she said, genuine concern in her voice. "Your safety matters far more than any information you might gather." "I will exercise appropriate caution, my lady," Mizuki assured her, touched by the young woman's concern. With final formalities completed, they mounted their horses and departed the Ishikawa compound. Their group consisted of Takashi, Mizuki, and 6 samurai escorts, a small enough party to travel quickly, but large enough to convey proper respect for the diplomatic mission. As they rode through the main gates and onto the road leading northward, Mizuki found herself experiencing an unexpected sensation, exhilaration. After months of quiet grief and purposelessness following Lady Haru's death, she was moving again, not just physically but mentally, engaged with the complex political landscape she had once navigated so effectively. Takashi, riding beside her, seemed to sense her mood. "It feels good to have purpose again, doesn't it?" he observed. Mizuki glanced at him, startled by how accurately he had read her thoughts. "Yes," she admitted, "though I would have preferred circumstances less fraught with potential conflict." "Few meaningful purposes come without risk," he replied. "But I believe we have a genuine opportunity to prevent bloodshed rather than merely postpone it." "How so?" "If we can establish that Nobuhide's actions represent personal ambition rather than his father's policy, we create space for resolution without either house losing face." He adjusted his hat against the strengthening morning sun. "Lord Takeda is shrewd, but not unreasonable. He may welcome an opportunity to curb his son's impetuousness while maintaining productive relations with the Ishikawa clan. Assuming he hasn't sanctioned the incursion as a calculated test of Ishikawa's resolve," Mizuki cautioned. Takashi nodded, accepting the alternative interpretation. "Indeed, which is why your observational skills will be as important as my formal negotiations. Between us, we must determine the true nature of Takeda's intentions." The casual "between us" suggested a partnership that both flattered and concerned Mizuki. She was unaccustomed to being positioned as an equal participant in such high-stakes matters, regardless of her actual contributions behind the scenes during her service to Lady Haru. "I will do what I can," she said simply, unwilling to promise more, until she better understood what awaited them at Takeda Castle. They travelled steadily through that first day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and take simple meals from the provisions they carried. The road followed a river valley northward, passing through prosperous farming villages and occasional stands of forest. Despite the beauty of the spring landscape, with fruit trees in bloom and new green touching the fields, Mizuki remained acutely aware of the tension underlying their journey. By late afternoon, they had reached a provincial town where arrangements had been made for their overnight accommodation. The local governor, a vassal of the Ishikawa clan, received them with appropriate ceremony in his modest residence. During the evening meal, Takashi maintained the pretense that Mizuki was his companion rather than merely another member of the diplomatic mission. He seated her beside him, included her in conversations where appropriate, and generally treated her with a level of consideration that clearly puzzled their host, but went unchallenged due to Takashi's rank and position. This arrangement provided Mizuki with opportunities to observe and listen in ways that would have been impossible had she been relegated to separate female quarters as protocol would typically dictate. She noticed, for instance, the governor's carefully neutral responses when Takeda's name was mentioned, suggesting either caution or divided loyalties given his province's position near the borders of both clans' territories. Later, when they retired to their separate sleeping chambers, Takashi found a moment to speak privately with Mizuki in the garden connecting their quarters. "You noticed the governor's reticence regarding Takeda," he said, confirming her own observation. Mizuki nodded. "His province would be among the first affected if conflict erupted. He must balance loyalties carefully." "Did you also note how his senior advisor kept redirecting conversation away from specific questions about local defenses?" "Yes, and how the servants tensed when trade routes to the north were discussed." Mizuki had been watching the attendants throughout the meal, reading the small tells that often revealed more than their master's careful words. Takashi smiled, clearly pleased with her observations. "We make a good team, Mizuki-san. You see what I miss, and perhaps I hear what you cannot." The compliment, delivered with what seemed like genuine appreciation, caused a warmth that Mizuki immediately tried to dismiss as mere professional satisfaction. This partnership was a temporary arrangement born of unusual circumstances, not a foundation for anything more lasting. "We should rest," she said practically. "Tomorrow's journey takes us closer to Takeda territory, where observations will matter even more." Takashi nodded, accepting her retreat to more formal interaction. "Indeed. Sleep well, Mizuki-san." The second day of travel brought them into increasingly mountainous terrain, where the road narrowed and sometimes clung precariously to hillsides above the river. Villages became smaller and farther apart, and travelers fewer. By midday, they had reached the nominal border between Ishikawa and Takeda lands, though this was precisely the region under dispute, with both clans claiming historical rights to the territory. As they stopped to rest the horses near a small shrine marking the traditional boundary, Takashi conferred with the leader of their samurai escort, a serious young man named Kenji, who had said little throughout the journey but maintained constant vigilance. "Any sign of Takeda patrols?" Mizuki overheard Takashi ask. "Nothing obvious," Kenji replied, "but there are watching eyes in those hills." He nodded toward the forested slopes rising steeply from the road. "We've been observed since mid-morning." "As expected," Takashi said with a nod. "We travel openly under diplomatic banner. Let them watch and report back that we approach as announced, not in stealth." When they resumed their journey, Takashi rode closer to Mizuki, occasionally pointing out features of the landscape as if they were merely travelers admiring the scenery. But his conversation carried weightier purpose beneath this casual appearance. "From this point forward, assume everything we say and do is observed and reported to Lord Takeda," he advised quietly. "Our formal diplomatic status protects us from direct interference, but not from scrutiny." "I understand," Mizuki replied, maintaining an appropriate smile, as if responding to some pleasant observation about the mountains rising around them. "It may become necessary to adapt our strategy based on what we encounter," Takashi continued. "If at any point you feel unsafe or observe something that requires immediate attention, we have a signal." He reached into his sleeve and withdrew a small folded paper. This contains a simple code we can use if separated or in company that prevents direct communication. Mizuki accepted the paper, tucking it carefully into her own sleeve without examining it. Such precautions might seem excessive for a diplomatic mission traveling under formal protection, but she understood the complex realities that often lay beneath surface courtesies between rival clans. By evening, they had reached a way station at the foot of the pass leading to Takeda Castle. Here, they were met by an official welcoming party, a middle-ranked Takeda samurai with his own escort, who greeted them with formal correctness that stopped just short of true warmth. Lord Takeda extends his welcome and looks forward to receiving Ishikawa's envoy tomorrow, the samurai announced after proper introductions had been exchanged. He has arranged accommodations for your party at this station tonight and will expect your arrival at midday tomorrow. Takashi acknowledged this with appropriate expressions of gratitude, and the Takeda samurai withdrew, leaving his own men to supplement the way station's usual staff in attending to the visitors' needs. The arrangements were comfortable, but clearly designed to keep the Ishikawa party contained and supervised. Meals were brought to them rather than served in common areas, and the Takeda guards positioned themselves in ways that would make private exploration of the station or its surroundings immediately noticeable. During their evening meal, served in a private dining room with only Takeda servants in attendance, Takashi and Mizuki maintained their roles as envoy and companion, speaking primarily of inconsequential matters suitable for potentially hostile ears. But when the servants withdrew temporarily to bring additional courses, Takashi leaned closer to Mizuki. "Tonight, listen more than you speak," he murmured. "The servants have been instructed to report our conversations, but they may reveal more than they gather if approached properly." Mizuki nodded slightly. This was familiar territory for her. The gentle art of extracting information from those believed to be merely serving rather than observing. During her years with Lady Haru, she had developed subtle techniques for encouraging servants, messengers, and other supposedly invisible attendants to share what they knew, often without realizing they had done so. That evening, as the Takeda servants prepared the sleeping chambers and brought warm water for bathing, Mizuki employed these skills with delicate precision, a sympathetic comment about the difficulty of serving foreign guests, a question about local customs she should observe to avoid giving offense, a mention of how the mountain air affected her breathing. Each seemingly innocent remark designed to elicit responses that might contain useful fragments of information. By the time she retired for the night, Mizuki had gathered several potentially significant insights. Nobuhide had returned to Takeda Castle 2 days earlier, supposedly to report on the border campaign, but rumored to have been summoned by his father. Lord Takeda had recently received messengers from both the Abe clan and the provincial governor, though the content of those communications remained closely guarded, and preparations were underway for some sort of ceremony or formal event at the castle, with kitchens working at unusual capacity. She relayed these discoveries to Takashi during a brief moment alone in the garden, where the sound of flowing water from a small stream helped mask their conversation from potential eavesdroppers. "Well done," he said, genuine appreciation evident despite his lowered voice. "The timing of Nobuhide's return is particularly interesting. If his father recalled him from the border campaign, it suggests Lord Takeda may indeed be more interested in controlling his son's actions than in pursuing actual territorial gain. And the preparations for a ceremony," Mizuki prompted, "could be anything from a seasonal observance to a political announcement. We'll learn more tomorrow, I expect." Takashi glanced toward the guards visible at the garden's entrance. "We should not appear too conspiratorial. Return to your chamber and I'll see you at dawn." Mizuki nodded and moved away, maintaining the appearance of a casual nighttime stroll rather than a strategic consultation. As she prepared for sleep in the simple but comfortable chamber provided for her, she found herself reflecting on how quickly she had fallen back into her role as information gatherer and analyst. The skills Lady Haru had valued and nurtured had not diminished during Mizuki's months of grief and purposelessness. They had merely waited dormant for proper circumstances to reawaken them. There was comfort in this realization, a sense that her lady's death had not ended everything they had built together. The abilities Mizuki had developed in Haru's service could still serve meaningful purposes, could still make difference in matters of consequence. With this thought providing unexpected solace, she drifted into sleep, preparing mentally for the challenges the next day would surely bring at Takeda Castle. Morning arrived with mist clinging to the mountains and the promise of warm spring weather once the sun burned through the haze. The Ishikawa party departed the way station after a simple breakfast, following their Takeda escorts up the winding road that led to the castle perched strategically on a mountain plateau. As they climbed, Mizuki found herself increasingly impressed by the natural defenses of the Takeda position. The road was the only practical approach for any sizable force, and it offered multiple points where even a small defensive contingent could effectively block advancing enemies. The Takeda clan's reputation for military prowess was evidently supported by excellent strategic choice in their primary stronghold's location. Takeda Castle itself came into view as they emerged from a final stretch of forested road, an imposing structure of stone foundations and multi-storied wooden buildings surrounded by substantial walls. Banners bearing the Takeda crest fluttered from towers and gates, and guards were visible at regular intervals along the battlements. They were received at the main gate with formal ceremony, neither effusively welcoming nor coldly minimal, but precisely calibrated to acknowledge their diplomatic status while maintaining appropriate reserve between rival clans. A senior retainer led them through multiple courtyards to a reception building where they would refresh themselves before the formal audience with Lord Takeda. Throughout this process, Takashi maintained Mizuki's position as his companion rather than a servant, ensuring she remained with the main party rather than being directed to women's quarters. The Takeda retainers accepted this arrangement with only minor hesitation, likely having been instructed to accommodate the Ishikawa envoy's preferences within reasonable bounds. As they were served tea in the reception building, Takashi briefed his samurai escort on protocol expectations and then turned to Mizuki with a quiet word. Lord Takeda will likely receive us in the main audience chamber with his senior retainers present. You will be the only woman in attendance, which will draw attention. Use that position to observe reactions to our diplomatic exchange, particularly from those standing behind Lord Takeda, who may believe themselves less scrutinized than those directly participating. Mizuki nodded, understanding the value of her unique position. Men focused on formal negotiations often missed subtle signals passing among observers or attendants, particularly when those signals came from servants or others deemed inconsequential to the proceedings. When the appointed hour arrived, they were escorted to the main audience hall, a large, imposing space with massive wooden pillars supporting a high ceiling. At the far end, on a slightly raised platform, knelt Lord Takeda himself, a man in his 60s with a stern countenance, streaks of grey in his beard, and the watchful eyes of someone who had navigated political and military challenges for decades. Arranged behind and to the sides of Lord Takeda were approximately 20 men of various ages and ranks. From senior advisors to military commanders, Mizuki noted that they were positioned according to status, with the most important figures closest to their lord. And there, at Lord Takeda's right hand, knelt a younger man whose features clearly marked him as the lord's son. This would be Nobuhide, recently returned from the border incursion and now in a position of honor that suggested he remained in his father's good graces despite being recalled from his military adventure. As formal introductions and ritualized greetings were exchanged, Mizuki kept her eyes modestly lowered, but her attention sharply focused. She noted the controlled tension in Nobuhide's posture, the way certain retainers exchanged glances when Ishikawa territories were mentioned, and most interestingly, the presence of a merchant seated somewhat apart from the samurai contingent, unusual in such a formal military and diplomatic setting. Once the ceremonial elements were complete, Takashi presented Lord Ishikawa's concerns with diplomatic precision, acknowledging the historical complexity of the border territories, while expressing alarm at the unexpected military incursion led by Lord Takeda's son. "My lord sends me not to issue demands or ultimatums," Takashi explained, "but to understand whether this action represents a change in the peaceful relations our clans have maintained these past 5 years, or whether it stems from more specific and limited concerns that might be addressed through negotiation rather than military confrontation." Lord Takeda listened impassively, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Takashi concluded, he remained silent for several moments before responding. "The Ishikawa concern is noted and understood," he said finally, his voice deep and measured. "The movements of Takeda forces within territories we consider historically ours were not intended as provocation but as reasonable assertion of long-standing claims. However, I recognize that perspectives may differ on these matters. It was a carefully calibrated response, neither apologetic nor aggressively defensive, leaving space for negotiation while conceding nothing substantive. To demonstrate our commitment to peaceful resolution," Lord Takeda continued, "I have recalled my son from the border region to participate in discussions here, rather than allowing military positioning to dictate diplomatic outcomes." At this, Nobuhide bowed formally, though Mizuki detected a tightness around his eyes that suggested the recall might not have been entirely voluntary or welcome. "Furthermore," Lord Takeda added, "I propose a 3-day council to address specific territorial concerns, with representatives from both our clans participating in good faith negotiations." As a gesture of sincerity, Takeda forces have already withdrawn from the most recently contested villages, maintaining presence only in areas we have consistently administered for generations. This was unexpected. A significant de-escalation offered without extracting prior concessions. Mizuki glanced at Takashi, curious how he would respond to this seemingly generous proposal. His expression remained appropriately diplomatic, but she detected genuine surprise in the slight raising of his eyebrows. "Lord Ishikawa would certainly welcome such a council," he replied smoothly. "The withdrawal of forces from contested areas demonstrates wisdom and restraint that my lord will undoubtedly appreciate." The formal exchange continued, establishing preliminary frameworks for the proposed council and addressing logistical matters. Throughout, Mizuki maintained her observation of those not directly participating in the conversation. She noted particular interest from the merchant when specific territories were mentioned, and a subtle but definite tension between Nobuhide and an older samurai who appeared to be a senior military advisor. When the audience concluded, Lord Takeda made an announcement that clarified one mystery Mizuki had been pondering. "You arrive at a fortuitous time," he informed Takashi. "This evening we celebrate the engagement of my daughter, Lady Yukiko, to Lord Abe's second son. As honored diplomatic guests, you and your party are welcome to join the festivities." This explained the preparations for a ceremony that the servants had mentioned, and it potentially revealed much more. An alliance forming between Takeda and Abe, which would significantly alter the power balance in the region if Ishikawa remained isolated. Takashi accepted the invitation with appropriate gratitude, though Mizuki could sense his mind working rapidly to incorporate this new information into his assessment of the situation. They were escorted back to guest quarters to rest and prepare for the evening celebration. Once they were relative privacy, with only their own samurai escort present, Takashi turned to Mizuki with an expectant look. "Your observations?" he asked quietly. "The engagement to the Abe clan is significant," she began. "It creates a potential alliance that would surround Ishikawa territories on two sides." Takashi nodded. "My thoughts exactly. The border provocation may have been intended not to seize territory, but to distract attention from this more significant political development." "There's more," Mizuki continued. "The merchant present at the audience, his clothing and position suggest he's not merely a local supplier, but someone of greater significance, possibly a representative of trading interests in the disputed territories." "Good eye," Takashi acknowledged. "That would explain why certain villages were mentioned specifically during the discussion of withdrawn forces. Some may have particular economic value beyond mere territorial claims." "And Nobu Hide," Mizuki added. His posture and expressions when his father mentioned the recall suggested resentment, not filial compliance. The tension between him and the older military advisor was particularly evident when the withdrawal of forces was announced. Takashi considered this thoughtfully, suggesting internal disagreement about the tactical retreat, or perhaps about the broader strategy involving the Abe alliance. "I couldn't determine specifically, but it's clearly not unified support for Lord Takeda's diplomatic approach." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of servants bringing formal clothing for the evening celebration, an unexpected courtesy from their host that also served as a reminder of their carefully managed status as honored but closely watched guests. The engagement celebration took place in Takeda Castle's main hall, transformed from its daytime austerity into a space of carefully cultivated elegance. Lanterns cast warm light over assembled guests. Low tables arranged in hierarchical patterns held elaborate refreshments, and musicians played traditional compositions in a corner. Mizuki, now dressed in a formal kimono provided by her hosts and considerably finer than anything she had brought for the journey, found herself in an unusual position. As Takashi's ostensible companion, she was seated beside him among mid-ranking guests, neither at the center of activities nor relegated to the periphery. This placement afforded excellent opportunities to observe interactions among the various factions present. Lady Yukiko, the bride-to-be, was a slender young woman of perhaps 18, with composed features that revealed little of her thoughts regarding the arranged match. She performed her ceremonial role with perfect propriety, though Mizuki noted she spoke little except when directly addressed by her father or prospective in-laws. The Abe contingent was relatively small, just the second son, Abe Yoshitaka, and a handful of retainers representing the family's interests. This limited presence was expected given that the formal engagement was a preliminary celebration. The actual wedding would presumably take place later, with full participation from the Abe clan leadership. As the evening progressed through carefully choreographed stages of ceremonial exchanges, artistic performances, and increasingly relaxed socializing, Mizuki employed all her skills of observation and subtle information gathering. She noted which Takeda retainers seemed most invested in the Abe alliance, which maintained cautious distance, and most interestingly, how Nobu Hide positioned himself throughout the celebration, always visible, always properly respectful, yet somehow communicating subtle separation from the proceedings. During a musical performance that drew most guests' attention, Mizuki found herself momentarily adjacent to a group of Takeda household women who had emerged to attend Lady Yukiko. Their conversation, pitched low beneath the music, caught her attention. "Third match arranged, and then dissolved before completion," one woman murmured. "The poor girl must wonder if this one will proceed to actual marriage." "The Abe alliance is different," another replied. "Lord Takeda needs their support too desperately to allow this arrangement to falter. Tell that to Lady Yukiko. After the Ishikawa disappointment, she's grown so reserved I can barely discern her thoughts anymore." Ishikawa disappointment. This caught Mizuki's full attention, though she maintained the appearance of focusing on the musical performance. "That was never officially announced," a third woman cautioned. "We shouldn't speak of it. Everyone knows Lord Takeda initially sought a match with the Ishikawa heir before settling on this Abe arrangement. Why else would Nobuhide harbor such resentment toward—" The woman stopped abruptly as an older female attendant approached, giving a warning glance that silenced the conversation immediately. Mizuki filed this fragment of information carefully away. If a previously attempted marriage alliance between Takeda and Ishikawa had failed, it might explain layers of tension beyond mere territorial disputes. And if Nobuhide had personal involvement or investment in that failed arrangement, it could shed light on his apparently provocative actions at the border. Later in the evening, as guests circulated more freely, Mizuki managed to position herself where she could overhear a conversation between Nobuhide and the merchant who had been present at the formal audience earlier. They spoke carefully, aware of their surroundings, but the merchant's concern was evident even in his measured tones. "Assurances regarding the northern trade routes," he was saying. "My consortium has made significant investments based on previous understandings. Temporary tactical adjustments don't change fundamental commitments," Nobuhide replied, his voice low but intense. "My father understands the importance of your consortium's support, as do I." "The Abe alliance complicates matters," the merchant observed. "Their interests in southern markets compete directly with our northern ambitions, which is precisely why balancing influences remains essential," Nobuhide said, with a significance that suggested layers of meaning beyond the obvious. "Foundations laid carefully now will support greater structures in time." The conversation shifted to more general topics as others approached. But Mizuki had heard enough to recognize that commercial interests played a larger role in the regional politics than had been explicitly acknowledged in the formal diplomatic discussions. She made her way back to where Takashi was engaged in appropriately cordial conversation with Takeda retainers, rejoining him with a respectful bow that maintained their pretense of personal connection beyond merely professional association. "Ah, Mizuki-san," he greeted her warmly. "I was just discussing the beauty of Takeda Castle's architecture with our gracious hosts. The integration of defensive necessities with aesthetic considerations is quite remarkable." It was innocent conversation, but his eyes held a question as they met hers briefly. She responded with an equally innocuous comment about the castle gardens, but positioned herself slightly closer than necessary, allowing her to speak just above a whisper when the retainers were momentarily distracted by a servant offering refreshments. Trade consortium, northern routes, competing with Abe's southern markets. Nobuhide deeply involved. Takashi gave no obvious reaction to this telegraphed intelligence, merely nodding slightly as he continued his architectural observations. But she knew he had registered the information and would incorporate it into his evolving understanding of the complex situation. As the celebration continued into the night, one more significant interaction caught Mizuki's attention. Lady Yukiko, after completing her formal obligations, withdrew to a slightly less central position where she was joined briefly by her brother Nobuhide. Though their exchange appeared outwardly proper, Mizuki, watching carefully, detected an intensity that suggested their conversation held more importance than casual sibling interaction at a celebration. Lady Yukiko's posture, slightly rigid, hands clasped perhaps too tightly, and Nobuhide's expression, controlled but with a tension around his eyes, hinted at disagreement or at least significant concern passing between them. The conversation ended abruptly when Lord Takeda glanced in their direction, both siblings immediately separating and returning to their expected positions with practiced composure that revealed nothing to less observant guests. By the time the evening's festivities concluded and the Ishikawa party withdrew to their assigned quarters, Mizuki's mind was filled with fragments of information, observed tensions, and half-heard conversations. The challenge now was to assemble these pieces into a coherent understanding of the true dynamics at play, and to determine how they might influence the diplomatic mission they had been sent to accomplish. She found an opportunity to share her observations with Takashi when he requested her assistance in reviewing documentation provided by their hosts regarding the disputed territories. It was a transparent excuse for private consultation, but one that would appear legitimate to any watching eyes. As they knelt at a low writing table, ostensibly examining maps and boundary descriptions, Mizuki quietly relayed what she had gleaned about the previously attempted marriage alliance with Ishikawa and the evident tension between the Takeda siblings regarding the current Abe arrangement. "This adds significant context," Takashi murmured, keeping his attention apparently focused on the documents before them. If Nobuhide's border provocation was partly motivated by lingering resentment over a failed marriage alliance, it suggests personal grudges may be amplifying political tensions, Mizuki concluded. But there's more concerning the trade consortium. The merchant spoke as if Nobuhide had made commitments regarding northern trade routes that might now be compromised by the Abe alliance, which apparently favors southern markets. Takashi's brow furrowed slightly as he absorbed this information. Economic interests often underlie territorial disputes, but this suggests a more specific factional alignment. Nobuhide may be positioning himself as champion of the northern trade interests, while his father balances multiple considerations, including the strategic advantage of the Abe alliance. Which would explain the tension we observe between Nobuhide and his father's senior advisors, Mizuki added. He may view the withdrawal from the disputed villages as sacrificing commitments he personally made to commercial interests. They continued discussing possibilities and implications, gradually assembling a more complete picture of the forces at work beneath the surface of formal diplomatic exchanges. What emerged was a nuanced understanding of Takeda clan internal politics, not merely the simplified narrative of an impetuous son acting against his father's wishes, but a complex interplay of personal ambitions, economic interests, and strategic considerations that created tensions even as the clan presented a relatively united front to outside observers. As they concluded their consultation, Takashi looked at Mizuki with undisguised appreciation. "Your insights have been invaluable," he said quietly. "Lord Ishikawa was wise to include you in this mission, though I doubt even he anticipated the depth of understanding you would bring to our efforts." The compliment, delivered with evident sincerity, caused an unexpected warmth to bloom in Mizuki's chest. She had grown accustomed to having her analytical abilities valued during her service to Lady Haru, but that had been a private appreciation, acknowledged only within the secluded chambers of the Maeda women's quarters. To have these same talents recognized openly by a man of Takashi's position and evident intelligence was both unfamiliar and oddly affecting. "I merely observe and report," she demurred. "The wisdom to apply such observations must come from others." False modesty doesn't suit you, Mizuki-san. Takashi replied with a small smile. You do far more than observe. You interpret, analyze, and connect disparate elements into coherent understanding. It's a rare talent, particularly when combined with the patience and precision you bring to the task. Before she could formulate a response to this unexpectedly direct praise, a soft knock at the door announced a servant bearing a message. Lord Takeda requested Takashi's presence for a private conversation before the evening concluded. This was potentially significant, a departure from formal protocols into more personal diplomacy. You should go, Mizuki said immediately. Such an invitation offers opportunities that formal audiences cannot. Takashi nodded agreement. Continue reviewing these materials in my absence. Any questions about boundaries or historical claims may prove useful in tomorrow's discussions. After he departed with the messenger, Mizuki found herself alone with her thoughts and the scattered documents on the table before her. The pretense of reviewing territorial claims soon gave way to deeper reflection on her current situation. 2 days ago, she had been sitting alone at a wedding celebration, an awkward reminder of loss tolerated out of obligation to the past. Now she was actively engaged in matters of genuine consequence, using abilities that had lain dormant since Lady Haru's death, working alongside someone who seemed to value her contributions without reservation. The reversal was so complete, so unexpected, that Mizuki found herself wondering what would happen when this diplomatic mission concluded. Would she return to her liminal position in the Maeda household? Would Takashi, having discovered her usefulness, find other purposes for her talents? Or would this brief period of meaningful engagement simply end, leaving her once again adrift without clear purpose? Such questions had no immediate answers. For now, she could only continue the task at hand, gathering, analyzing, and providing whatever insights might help navigate the complex situation they faced at Takeda Castle. When Takashi returned nearly an hour later, his expression revealed little of what had transpired in his private meeting with Lord Takeda. He waited until the servant who had escorted him had withdrawn before speaking, and even then kept his voice low. Lord Takeda is more forthcoming in private than in formal settings, he began, settling across from Mizuki at the writing table. He acknowledged directly that Nobuhide's border action exceeded his instructions and created complications he had not intended. Did he explain the purpose behind the original instructions? Mizuki asked. Only in general terms, something about demonstrating continued Takeda interest in the territories without triggering actual conflict. But more significantly, he raised the matter of his daughter's engagement and the broader implications of the Abe alliance. In what context? He wanted to ensure Lord Ishikawa understands this alliance is not intended as a threat to Ishikawa interests, despite creating what might appear to be an encirclement. Takashi's expression suggested he found this assurance less than entirely convincing. He emphasized that balanced relationships among the 3 major houses would benefit regional stability. While conveniently strengthening Takeda's position as the central power broker, Mizuki observed. Precisely. Takashi smiled slightly at her quick grasp of the implications. But there was something more, a personal note in his manner when discussing these arrangements. He mentioned, almost in passing, that his daughter had once hoped for a different alliance before circumstances intervened. Boo the failed Ishikawa match, Mizuki supplied. Yes, though he didn't state it explicitly. There was a hint of regret, quickly masked, that suggested the current Abe arrangement might be expedient rather than preferred. This aligned with what Mizuki had overheard among the Takeda women. Did he give any indication why the previous match failed to materialize? No, but he asked about Noboru Ishikawa's recent marriage. in a way that seemed designed to assess whether that relationship was merely political or genuinely harmonious. An interesting angle, Mizuki thought. If Lord Takeda had once hoped to ally his daughter with the Ishikawa heir, Noboru's recent marriage to Akiko Maeda would have definitively closed that possibility. Might some of the current tensions stem from that foreclosed opportunity? Tomorrow's council discussions should be enlightening, Takashi continued. With these additional insights, we're better positioned to understand the currents beneath the formal diplomatic exchanges. What role would you have me play? Mizuki asked practically. Continue as you have been, observing, gathering impressions, particularly regarding the dynamics among Takeda retainers and family members. I suspect Nobuhide's faction may reveal more of their positions during substantive discussions of specific territories and arrangements. They spent another hour reviewing strategy for the following day's negotiations before retiring to their separate chambers for much-needed rest. As Mizuki prepared for sleep, she found herself reflecting on how completely her position had transformed in the space of just a few days. From isolated grieving companion to active participant in significant diplomatic efforts, it was a transition that would have seemed impossible to imagine at the wedding where this journey began. More surprising still was how natural this new role felt, as if she had simply stepped back into her true self after months of diminished existence. Lady Haru had recognized and nurtured Mizuki's analytical abilities, but always within the protected sphere of women's quarters and indirect influence. Now, these same talents were being applied directly, acknowledged openly, and valued explicitly by someone who himself operated in the public world of power and consequence. The following day brought the formal council Lord Takeda had proposed, with representatives from both clans gathering to address specific territorial claims and potential resolutions. The discussions were detailed and sometimes technical, focusing on historical boundaries, administrative arrangements, and economic considerations for disputed villages and regions. Throughout, Mizuki maintained her position as Takashi's companion, observing carefully as different factions within the Takeda leadership revealed their priorities and concerns. Nobuhide participated actively, often advocating for stronger Takeda claims in northern areas that, not coincidentally, Mizuki noted, aligned with the trade consortium interests she had identified the previous evening. The merchant she had observed was present for portions of the discussion, ostensibly providing information about commercial activities in the disputed regions, but clearly representing specific interests rather than offering neutral assessment. His interventions consistently supported positions that would maintain Takeda control of key northern trade routes, while compromising on less economically significant territories. By midday, the outlines of a potential agreement had begun to emerge, one that would restore most of the recently contested villages to Ishikawa administration, while confirming Takeda authority over certain northern routes and mountain passes. It represented a reasonable diplomatic compromise, though Mizuki noted that Nobuhide's expression grew increasingly reserved as the shape of the agreement developed. During a break in the formal proceedings, as participants refreshed themselves with tea and light refreshments, Mizuki found herself briefly alone in a garden courtyard. She had stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection, away from the intense concentration of the council discussions. To her surprise, she was joined by Lady Yukiko, who approached with the careful composure expected of a noble daughter, but a directness in her gaze that suggested purpose rather than chance encounter. "You are the companion of the Ishikawa envoy," Lady Yukiko observed, after appropriate greetings had been exchanged. "Yes, my lady," Mizuki replied with a respectful bow. "Mizuki Tanaka, at your service." T, you watch and listen with remarkable attention, the young woman continued. I noticed yesterday, during the celebration and again during this morning's council, you miss very little that occurs around you. It was a perceptive observation, delivered without accusation, but with clear recognition of Mizuki's role beyond mere companionship. I find diplomatic proceedings fascinating, Mizuki replied carefully. One can learn much about a clan's values and concerns from how they approach such negotiations. Lady Yukiko smiled slightly. A diplomatic answer worthy of the council chamber itself. She glanced toward the building where the discussions continued, ensuring they remained unobserved before continuing in a lower voice. My brother believes he acts in our clan's best interests, even when his methods create complications for our father's broader strategies. This unexpected confidence, from the daughter of their host to a virtual stranger allied with potential rivals, left Mizuki momentarily speechless. Lady Yukiko seemed to recognize her surprise and continued with calm intensity. I tell you this not to betray family confidence, but because balanced understanding serves everyone's interests. Nobuhide's actions at the border were not merely impetuous, nor solely motivated by personal grievances, though those elements exist. He genuinely believes certain economic alliances are essential to our clan's future prosperity, even if pursuing them creates temporary diplomatic tensions. And the Abe engagement? Mizuki asked carefully. Does that serve these same economic interests? A shadow crossed Lady Yukiko's features, quickly controlled. The Abe alliance serves strategic purposes my father values. My role is to facilitate those purposes through the means traditionally available to women of my position. There was resignation in her voice, but not self-pity. Rather, the practical acceptance of one who understands their duty within a system that offers limited choices. It reminded Mizuki of conversations with Lady Haru, who had similarly recognized the constraints of her position while finding ways to exert influence within those boundaries. Your insight into your brother's motivations is valuable, Mizuki said sincerely. It suggests possibilities for resolution that acknowledge legitimate interests while addressing problematic methods. Lady Yukiko nodded slightly. That is my hope in sharing these thoughts. She straightened, resuming her more formal demeanor as voices approached from the main building. I wish you a pleasant remainder of your stay at Takeda Castle, Tanaka-san. With that, she withdrew, passing a group of Takeda retainers with appropriate acknowledgments as they entered the garden. Mizuki remained a moment longer, absorbing the significance of this unexpected conversation before returning to the council chambers to find Takashi. She found an opportunity to relay the substance of Lady Yukiko's comments during another brief recess in the proceedings. Takashi listened with evident interest, particularly to the characterization of Nobuhide's motivations as extending beyond mere personal ambition or resentment. This aligns with patterns I've observed in the negotiations, he acknowledged. He advocates most strongly for positions that secure economic advantages, even when traditional territorial claims might suggest different priorities. And Lady Yukiko's willingness to provide this context suggests she sees benefit in a resolution that acknowledges these interests explicitly, Mizuki added, perhaps creating space for both the Abe alliance her father values and the northern trade relationships her brother champions. Takashi considered this thoughtfully. A balanced approach that serves multiple facets of Takeda strategy while still addressing Ishikawa's legitimate concerns about border security and village administration. Exactly, Mizuki confirmed, pleased that he had immediately grasped the implication of her insights. This understanding informed Takashi's approach when the council reconvened for afternoon discussions. Without explicitly revealing the source of his revised perspective, He began framing potential compromises in terms that acknowledged both traditional territorial considerations and the economic interests underlying certain disputed regions. Lord Ishikawa recognizes that prosperity serves all clans in the region. He stated at one point, secure trade routes benefit not merely their controllers, but all who participate in the commerce they facilitate. Perhaps certain administrative arrangements might be developed that maintain Takeda oversight of key northern passages while ensuring Ishikawa villages receive fair participation in resulting trade opportunities. This framing, which repositioned the discussion from zero-sum territorial control to mutual economic benefit, visibly shifted the dynamic in the council chamber. Nobuhide, who had been growing increasingly withdrawn as compromises diminished Takeda claims, suddenly re-engaged with evident interest. Lord Takeda himself nodded thoughtfully, exchanging glances with senior advisors that suggested appreciation for this constructive approach. By evening, when the council adjourned for the day, substantial progress had been made toward a comprehensive agreement. The framework that emerged would restore most recently contested villages to Ishikawa administration, while confirming Takeda authority over northern trade routes, but with guaranteed access and participation rights for Ishikawa interests, creating economic interdependence rather than exclusive control. As they returned to their quarters to prepare for the evening meal, Takashi's satisfaction was evident despite his maintained diplomatic reserve. "We've made remarkable progress," he observed, once they were relatively private. "Lord Ishikawa will be pleased with both the substantive outcomes and the relationship improvements this agreement represents." "The economic provisions seem particularly significant," Mizuki noted. "They address Nobuhide's concerns while still meeting Ishikawa's core requirements regarding village administration and border security. Indeed, your insights regarding the trade consortium interests proved invaluable in shaping that approach." Takashi studied her with undisguised appreciation. Few diplomats have the benefit of such perceptive counsel. Again, his direct acknowledgement of her contribution caused an unexpected warmth to bloom within Mizuki. She had grown accustomed to operating in the shadows during her service to Lady Haru, her influence acknowledged only in private and her insights valued but rarely credited openly. This explicit recognition of her role was both unfamiliar and deeply satisfying. "I merely provided fragments of information," she demurred. "You crafted them into a diplomatic strategy that serves all interests." "False modesty again," Takashi chided gently. "We both know your contributions extended far beyond fragments of information. Without your observations regarding the trade dynamics and Lady Yukiko's unexpected insights, we might still be locked in positional bargaining over village boundaries." Before Mizuki could respond to this direct praise, a messenger arrived with an invitation. Lord Takeda requested their presence at a private dinner that evening, with only family members and the Ishikawa envoy's party in attendance. This was a significant honor and suggested the day's productive negotiations had indeed created a warming of relations. The dinner took place in a smaller, more intimate hall than the previous evening's celebration. The gathering was limited to Lord Takeda, his children Nobuhide and Yukiko, 3 senior retainers, and the Ishikawa party, consisting of Takashi, Mizuki, and their lead samurai escort, Kenji. The reduced formality and limited attendance created space for more direct conversation than would be possible in larger ceremonial settings. Throughout the meal, Mizuki continued her careful observation of interactions and dynamics among the Takeda family members. She noted that Nobuhide, while still maintaining appropriate deference to his father, appeared more engaged and less resentful than during previous encounters. Lady Yukiko remained primarily silent, except when directly addressed. but her occasional glances toward Mizuki suggested continued awareness of their shared understanding. Lord Takeda himself proved to be a thoughtful host, discussing regional history, artistic traditions, and philosophical matters with evident erudition. He seemed particularly interested in Takashi's background and experiences, asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity about the younger man's perspective on governance and clan leadership. As the evening progressed and formality gradually relaxed with the serving of sake, Lord Takeda turned the conversation toward the pending agreement they had been negotiating. "We have made good progress today," he observed. "Better than I had initially anticipated, given the complications that preceded your arrival. Mutual understanding often reveals shared interests beneath apparent conflicts," Takashi replied diplomatically. "Both our lords ultimately seek stability and prosperity for their clans and regions." "True enough," Lord Takeda acknowledged with a slight nod. "Though stability sometimes requires weathering periods of uncertainty, particularly when younger generations bring fresh perspectives that challenge established patterns. This oblique reference to Nobuhide's actions drew all eyes momentarily to the son, who inclined his head respectfully but offered a measured response. "Innovation and tradition need not be opposed," he said carefully. "The wisdom of experience can guide the energy of new endeavors, provided both are accorded appropriate respect." It was a diplomatic formulation that acknowledged his father's authority while maintaining the legitimacy of his own initiatives, a subtle but significant shift from the barely concealed resentment Mizuki had observed earlier. "Well said," Lord Takeda replied with apparent approval, "and perhaps a principle that might apply more broadly to relations between houses as well as generations." The conversation continued in this vein, philosophical yet with clear political undertones, exploring concepts of balance, innovation, and respect for tradition that had obvious applications to the diplomatic situation at hand. Throughout, Mizuki noted how Takashi engaged thoughtfully with these abstract discussions, while maintaining clear focus on their practical implications for the agreement being negotiated. As the evening drew toward its conclusion, Lord Takeda made a somewhat unexpected announcement. "Tomorrow, before resuming our formal council, I would be honored if you would join our family in a traditional viewing of the castle gardens. The spring blossoms are at their peak, and such beauty offers perspective that sometimes eludes us in council chambers." "We would be honored," Takashi replied with a respectful bow. The invitation, while ostensibly social and cultural, clearly offered opportunity for less formal discussion of remaining issues before returning to the structured environment of official negotiations. It represented another step in the gradually warming relations between the hosts and their diplomatic guests. When they returned to their quarters later that evening, Takashi and Mizuki took advantage of the relative privacy to assess the day's developments and prepare for the following morning's garden viewing and subsequent negotiations. Lord Takeda seems genuinely committed to reaching a comprehensive agreement, Takashi observed as they knelt across from each other in the small study adjoining their sleeping chambers. "More so than I anticipated when we first arrived. The improved understanding of trade interests has helped considerably," Mizuki agreed. "But I sense there's something more, a personal element underlying his engagement with these negotiations. His questions about my background and experience seemed unusually detailed for diplomatic courtesy," Takashi acknowledged, almost as if he were evaluating me for some purpose beyond my role as Ishikawa's envoy. Mizuki had noticed the same pattern, and his comments about balancing tradition with innovation, while ostensibly philosophical, carried implications about leadership succession and clan direction that seemed pointed. "You think he's considering his own succession planning?" Takashi asked, raising an eyebrow. Nobuhide is his heir apparent, despite the recent complications. Perhaps he's assessing options or alliances that might moderate his son's more aggressive tendencies, Mizuki suggested. The references to younger generations bringing fresh perspectives seemed deliberately ambiguous, acknowledging Nobuhide's initiatives while neither fully endorsing nor rejecting them. They continued discussing possibilities and implications well into the night, analyzing every nuance of conversation and interaction they had observed. By the time they retired to their separate sleeping chambers, both were thoroughly prepared for the opportunities and challenges the following day would likely bring. The morning dawned clear and mild, perfect for the garden viewing Lord Takeda had arranged. The castle gardens were indeed at their spring peak, with cherry blossoms, early irises, and carefully trained pine creating a harmonious landscape that demonstrated both natural beauty and human artistry in equal measure. Lord Takeda himself led the small party through winding paths, pointing out particular features with evident pride and knowledge. The group included the same limited attendance as the previous evening's dinner, a sign of continued emphasis on building personal connections rather than merely formal diplomatic relations. As they paused beside a small ornamental lake where koi swam beneath floating cherry petals, Lord Takeda separated slightly from the main group, gesturing for Takashi to join him. Mizuki, maintaining her role as companion, remained close enough to observe, but not so near as to appear intrusive in what was clearly intended as a more private conversation. From her position, she could see the two men engaged in serious discussion, Lord Takeda speaking with unusual animation, while Takashi listened intently, occasionally offering brief responses. Though she couldn't hear their words, their expressions and gestures suggested matters of significance beyond mere diplomatic pleasantries or garden appreciation. Meanwhile, Nobuhide had drawn the samurai escort into conversation about martial training traditions in their respective clans. A typical subject for warriors, but conducted with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than competitive comparison. Lady Yukiko, standing somewhat apart from these groups, caught Mizuki's eye and approached with measured grace. "The gardens offer respite from formal negotiations," she observed quietly. "Yet even here, important exchanges continue, do they not?" "Beauty and strategy need not be separate realms," Mizuki replied, matching the young woman's oblique style of conversation. Lady Yukiko smiled slightly. "Indeed, my father appreciates both equally." She glanced toward where Lord Takeda and Takashi continued their private discussion. "He has been impressed by your envoy's approach to our recent complications. Not merely his diplomatic skill, but his character and perspective. Kuroda-san serves his lord with both intelligence and integrity," Mizuki said, careful to maintain appropriate formality despite the more personal nature of their exchange. "Qualities increasingly rare in our troubled times," Lady Yukiko agreed. "My father values such attributes highly, particularly when considering alliances and future arrangements." There was something significant in her emphasis, a hint of meaning beyond the obvious that Mizuki couldn't quite decipher. Before she could explore further, Lord Takeda concluded his conversation with Takashi and rejoined the main group, guiding them toward another section of the garden where a small pavilion had been prepared for morning refreshments. As they walked, Takashi maneuvered to fall into step beside Mizuki, maintaining the appearance of casual companionship while creating opportunity for brief, private exchange. "Lord Takeda has proposed an additional element to our agreement," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "One that extends beyond territorial arrangements to more personal alliances." Mizuki glanced at him questioningly, but they had reached the pavilion, where servants awaited with tea and seasonal delicacies, preventing further explanation. The gathering settled into appropriate positions for this informal refreshment, with conversation returning to safer topics of seasonal observations and cultural appreciations. Only later, as they returned from the gardens to prepare for the day's formal council session, did Takashi have opportunity to elaborate on Lord Takeda's proposal. When they reached the relative privacy of their guest quarters, he drew Mizuki into the small study where they had conferred the previous evening. "Lord Takeda is considering a marriage alliance," he explained without preamble, "between Lady Yukiko and a suitable Ishikawa relation to solidify the territorial agreement we've been negotiating." This was significant but not entirely surprising given the hints Lady Yukiko had offered during their garden conversation. "Did he suggest a specific candidate?" Mizuki asked. "Not explicitly, but he inquired about Lord Ishikawa's nephew, the son of his younger brother, who would be approximately Lady Yukiko's age and is currently unattached." Takashi's expression suggested he found this development intriguing, but potentially complicated. Such an alliance would indeed strengthen the territorial agreement considerably, creating family bonds alongside diplomatic arrangements. It might also address whatever personal disappointment resulted from the previously failed match between Takeda and Ishikawa houses, Mizuki observed, though not directly involving the heir, who is now married to Akiko Maeda. Takashi nodded thoughtfully. "Precisely. It would restore the concept of alliance between the houses while accommodating the reality that Noboru Ishikawa is no longer available as a potential match." "How did you respond to this suggestion?" Mizuki asked, curious about his diplomatic handling of such a delicate matter. "With appropriate interest but necessary caution," Takashi replied. "I indicated that Lord Ishikawa would certainly value such a strengthened connection, but that formal marriage proposals would require consultation beyond my current authority as envoy." "A proper diplomatic response," Mizuki acknowledged. "But what is your assessment of the true purpose behind this proposal? Is it merely to strengthen the territorial agreement, or does Lord Takeda have additional motivations?" Takashi considered the question carefully before responding. "I suspect multiple layers of purpose, as with most significant political maneuvers. The alliance would indeed reinforce our territorial compromises, but it might also serve internal Takeda clan interests. By balancing the Abe engagement with an equally significant Ishikawa connection," Mizuki suggested. "Yes, creating multiple alliance vectors rather than committing solely to one direction." Takashi moved to the window, gazing out at the castle courtyard below, where preparations were underway for the day's council session. But there's something more personal in Lord Takeda's manner when discussing this possibility, an element I can't quite identify, but that suggests deeper significance than mere strategic positioning. This aligned with Mizuki's own impressions from observing interactions among the Takeda family members. There were currents of meaning and relationships beneath the surface that remained partially obscured despite their careful observations. "The formal council resumes shortly," Takashi noted, turning back from the window. "We should prepare for the final negotiations on territorial specifics, while remaining alert to how this marriage proposal might influence the proceedings." The day's council session proceeded with remarkable efficiency, building on the framework developed during previous discussions to address specific details of village administration, trade route access, and security arrangements in the disputed territories. The outline of a comprehensive agreement emerged more clearly with each hour, reflecting substantial compromise from both sides while preserving core interests for each clan. Throughout, Mizuki observed subtle shifts in the dynamics among Takeda representatives. Nobuhide, who had initially approached the negotiations with barely concealed resentment, now participated constructively, focusing particularly on provisions that protected northern trade interests. Lord Takeda maintained strategic oversight, while allowing his retainers appropriate authority in their areas of expertise. Even Lady Yukiko made a brief appearance during a ceremonial tea interval, her presence unusual in such predominantly male proceedings, but clearly intended to signal the potential for deeper alliance beyond mere territorial arrangement. By late afternoon, the substantive elements of the agreement had been resolved, leaving only formal documentation and ceremonial confirmation to complete the diplomatic process. Lord Takeda proposed a concluding ceremony the following morning, after which the Ishikawa party would be free to return with the completed agreement for their lord's final approval. "Your journey has proven more productive than perhaps either of us anticipated when you arrived," Lord Takeda observed to Takashi as the council adjourned. "What began as potential conflict has evolved into opportunity for strengthened relations. Wisdom on both sides made such transformation possible," Takashi replied with appropriate diplomatic courtesy. "Lord Ishikawa will be pleased with both the specific provisions and the improved understanding between our houses. And perhaps with additional possibilities for alliance that extend beyond parchment agreements," Lord Takeda added with subtle significance. "We will speak further of such matters this evening in more appropriate settings than council chambers. This reference to the marriage proposal remained appropriately oblique in the semi-public setting of the concluding council, but its implication was clear to those privy to the earlier conversation. The territorial agreement, while valuable in itself, might serve as foundation for more comprehensive alliance between the houses if the marriage proposal proceeded. That evening brought a celebratory banquet to mark the successful negotiations, with broader attendance than the previous night's private dinner. Various Takeda retainers, military commanders, and even representatives from regional merchant associations joined the gathering, creating an atmosphere of accomplishment and forward-looking cooperation rather than merely concluded diplomacy. Mizuki, again positioned as Takashi's companion rather than relegated to separate women's quarters, had opportunity to observe the varied reactions among Takeda factions to the emerging alliance with Ishikawa. Most seemed genuinely supportive, recognizing the benefits of reduced border tensions and potential economic cooperation. A few, particularly among Nobuhide's closer associates, maintained subtle reservations, though these appeared focused on specific implementation details rather than the agreement's fundamental approach. The merchant representative she had observed earlier circulated through the gathering, engaging different groups in conversation that Mizuki couldn't overhear, but that appeared to focus on practical commercial implications of the new arrangements. His manner suggested cautious satisfaction rather than either enthusiasm or disappointment, a pragmatic assessment of opportunities within the framework now established. As the evening progressed, Lord Takeda once again created opportunity for more private conversation, inviting Takashi to view a particularly valued scroll collection in his personal study. Mizuki, not included in this specific invitation, remained at the banquet, maintaining appropriate social engagement while continuing her observations of various factions and reactions. She was somewhat surprised when Lady Yukiko approached her again, this time with slightly less caution than during their previous exchanges. "My father speaks with your envoy about matters that will shape both our futures," the young woman observed after appropriate greetings had been exchanged, "yet neither of us is present for that conversation." It was a remarkably direct acknowledgement of their parallel positions, both influential in some respects, yet excluded from direct participation in decisions that would affect them significantly. Mizuki recognized the implicit invitation to more honest exchange beneath the superficially casual observation. "Traditional arrangements often proceed thus," she replied carefully, "though I have found that influence need not always require formal presence." Lady Yukiko smiled slightly. "As demonstrated by your considerable impact on these negotiations, despite having no official diplomatic role." She glanced around to ensure they weren't closely observed before continuing in a lower voice. "May I ask your impression of the Ishikawa household? Not diplomatic assessments, but personal observations of daily life and relationships." The question confirmed Mizuki's suspicion that Lady Yukiko was well aware of the marriage proposal being discussed and sought information beyond what formal negotiations would reveal. It was a natural concern for any woman contemplating arranged marriage into an unfamiliar household. "I have limited direct experience with the main Ishikawa residence," Mizuki admitted honestly, "but I have observed genuine respect among family members, thoughtful consideration of retainers' contributions, and particular attention to scholarly and artistic pursuits alongside necessary military preparedness." And the younger generation? The nephew who might be considered a suitable match. So Lady Yukiko had indeed been informed of the specific possibility being discussed. "Yoshiro Ishikawa shares his uncle's intellectual interests while maintaining appropriate martial training," Mizuki replied, drawing on knowledge gathered during her years with the Maeda family, which had maintained connections with both Ishikawa and Takeda clans. "He is said to have a thoughtful temperament and particular appreciation for traditional poetry and garden design." These were carefully chosen details that Mizuki believed would appeal to Lady Yukiko based on observations of the young woman's own evident refinement and artistic sensitivity. While she would not misrepresent the potential match, neither would she withhold information that might help the Takeda daughter view the possibility more favorably. "Thank you for your candor," Lady Yukiko said, after a moment's consideration. "It is rare to receive such straightforward assessment rather than merely diplomatic pleasantries when discussing potential alliances. You deserve honest insight for decisions of such consequence," Mizuki replied simply. Lady Yukiko studied her with renewed interest. "You are an unusual companion for a diplomatic envoy. Your understanding extends well beyond what one typically encounters in such roles." It was a gentle probe regarding Mizuki's true position and background, delivered with tact but clear curiosity. Before Mizuki could formulate an appropriate response that neither revealed too much nor seemed evasively dishonest, they were interrupted by the return of Lord Takeda and Takashi from their private discussion. The remainder of the evening proceeded with appropriate celebration of the completed negotiations, though Mizuki noted subtle currents of additional significance beneath the formal diplomatic exchanges. Something had clearly been decided or at least substantially advanced during the private discussion between Lord Takeda and Takashi, though its precise nature remained unconfirmed until they returned to their quarters later that night. "The marriage alliance has moved from possibility to preliminary arrangement," Takashi informed her, once they had privacy to speak freely. "Lord Takeda has formally proposed a match between Lady Yukiko and Yoshiro Ishikawa, with details to be confirmed following our return and consultation with Lord Ishikawa himself. This represents significant commitment beyond the territorial agreement," Mizuki observed. "Did Lord Takeda explain his motivations more fully in private?" "To some extent," Takashi replied, his expression suggesting he was still processing aspects of their conversation. "He spoke of balance, both between external alliances and within internal clan dynamics. The Abe engagement represents one strategic direction, while an Ishikawa connection offers counterweight that prevents excessive dependence on any single alliance." "And Nobuhide? How does this affect his position and ambitions?" That remains somewhat ambiguous, Takashi acknowledged. Lord Takeda indicated that his son's northern trade initiatives would receive continued support, but within a framework that balances multiple interests rather than allowing any single faction to dominate clan policy. It was a diplomatic solution to internal tensions as well as external relations, creating space for Nobuhide's economic vision while maintaining Lord Takeda's broader strategic perspective. The marriage alliance with Ishikawa would reinforce this balanced approach, preventing complete commitment to either the Abe direction or Nobuhide's northern focus. There's one additional element, Takashi added after a moment's hesitation. Lord Takeda expressed particular interest in our partnership during these negotiations. Our partnership? Mizuki repeated, uncertain of his meaning. Yes. He noted the effectiveness of our collaborative approach, your observational insights, complementing my formal diplomatic role. Takashi seemed uncharacteristically hesitant as he continued. He suggested such complementary capabilities represent a model that might benefit broader relations between our houses. Mizuki considered this with growing understanding of its potential implications. He sees our working relationship as emblematic of the kind of practical alliance he envisions between Takeda and Ishikawa, one that recognizes different strengths and perspectives while pursuing shared objectives. Precisely. Takashi met her gaze directly, and he intimated that continued collaboration beyond this specific mission might serve both our interests and those of our respective houses. This subtle suggestion of ongoing partnership beyond their current diplomatic assignment caught Mizuki by surprise. She had assumed their collaboration would naturally conclude once they returned with the completed agreement, with each resuming their separate roles and responsibilities. What form would such continued collaboration take? She asked carefully. That remains undefined, Takashi admitted. Lord Takeda merely planted the seed of possibility, noting that talents such as yours are too valuable to return to obscurity once this particular mission concludes. The observation echoed Takashi's own earlier comments about Mizuki's abilities withering when unused after Lady Haru's death. It suggested recognition of her capabilities that extended beyond this specific diplomatic context, a recognition that both honored her contributions and raised questions about her future role once they returned from Takeda Castle. These questions remained unresolved as they prepared for the following morning's formal conclusion of negotiations. The ceremonial signing of the territorial agreement proceeded with appropriate dignity and ritual, establishing new boundaries, administrative arrangements, and economic cooperation between the clans. The potential marriage alliance received only a oblique reference in official documentation, noted as a matter for continued favorable discussion rather than a confirmed arrangement, though private understandings between Lord Takeda and Takashi established more definite expectations. As they prepared to depart Takeda Castle with the completed agreement, Lord Takeda honored them with formal gifts, traditional tokens of respect for diplomatic visitors, but Mizuki received an additional, more personal offering, a delicate hairpin of carved jade presented by Lady Yukiko herself with words that carried significance beyond mere ceremonial courtesy. "To remember our conversations," the Takeda daughter said quietly as she placed the ornament in Mizuki's hands, "and perhaps to continue them under different circumstances in the future." It was a clear indication that Lady Yukiko anticipated Mizuki's continued involvement in relations between the houses, potentially including her own transition to the Ishikawa household if the marriage alliance proceeded. The gesture touched Mizuki deeply, not merely for its material value, but for the recognition it represented, acknowledgement of her role and perspective from someone who understood the complexities of navigating influential positions without formal authority. Their journey back to Ishikawa territory proceeded without incident, though with a decidedly different atmosphere than their outward trip. What had begun as urgent diplomatic intervention to prevent potential conflict had transformed into return with successful agreement, improved understanding, and foundations for deeper alliance between previously tense neighbors. Throughout the 3-day journey, Mizuki found herself contemplating what awaited upon their return. The diplomatic mission had given her purpose and engagement after months of emotional isolation following Lady Haru's death. Takashi had valued her contributions openly, positioning her as partner rather than subordinate in their shared efforts. Lord Takeda had recognized capabilities that had previously operated only in the shadows of women's quarters. Even Lady Yukiko had acknowledged her as someone worthy of continued connection beyond this specific encounter. But what would happen once the diplomatic context that enabled these unusual dynamics concluded? Would she return to her ambiguous position in the Maeda household, neither fully family nor merely servant, a living reminder of loss rather than contributor to present purposes? Would the appreciation for her abilities expressed during this mission translate into continued, meaningful engagement? Or would social conventions reassert themselves once they returned to more traditional settings? Takashi seemed to sense her preoccupation as they neared their destination on the final day of travel. Riding beside her as the Ishikawa estates came into view in the distance, he spoke quietly enough that their escort could not overhear. "You're concerned about what follows our return," he observed with characteristic perceptiveness. Mizuki didn't bother denying what was evidently clear to him. This mission created unusual circumstances that allowed for unconventional arrangements, she replied carefully. Such exceptions rarely persist once their immediate purpose concludes. Unless those involved choose to establish new patterns rather than reverting to old ones, Takashi suggested. The territorial agreement we're returning with creates new frameworks for interaction between Takeda and Ishikawa. Perhaps it need not be the only relationship that finds revised definition. That is, the implication was both encouraging and somewhat unsettling in its ambiguity. Before Mizuki could ask for clarification, they were spotted by sentries at the outer perimeter of Ishikawa lands, and formal protocols for returning diplomatic parties took precedence over personal conversation. Their arrival at the main Ishikawa compound was met with appropriate ceremony. The successful completion of their mission evident in the respectful reception they received. Lord Ishikawa himself greeted them in the main audience hall, eager to review the agreement they had secured and hear detailed report of their negotiations. Mizuki expected to be dismissed at this point, her unconventional inclusion in the diplomatic party naturally concluding as they returned to normal household operations. But to her surprise, Takashi specifically requested her presence during the formal debriefing, positioning her once again as valuable contributor rather than merely accompanying companion. Tanaka-san's observations proved essential to our understanding of Takeda clan dynamics, he explained to Lord Ishikawa. Her insights regarding factional interests and personal motivations informed our approach to key provisions of the agreement. Lord Ishikawa, to his credit, accepted this unusual arrangement without obvious skepticism, focusing primarily on substantive outcomes rather than procedural unorthodoxy. As Takashi presented the territorial agreement's major provisions, he consistently acknowledged Mizuki's contributions to specific elements, particularly those involving trade arrangements and internal Takeda politics. The potential marriage alliance received more careful treatment, discussed only after preliminary review of the territorial provisions had been completed and with appropriate diplomatic circumspection. Here too, however, Takashi noted Mizuki's interactions with Lady Yukiko as providing valuable perspective on the Takeda daughter's character and potential compatibility with Ishikawa household traditions. Throughout this formal debriefing, Mizuki maintained appropriate reserve, speaking only when directly addressed, but providing clear, insightful responses that demonstrated both her understanding of diplomatic complexities and her careful observation during their stay at Takeda Castle. She was acutely aware of the unusual nature of her participation, but determined to honor the trust Takashi had shown in including her so prominently in these proceedings. When the formal review concluded, Lord Ishikawa expressed unreserved approval of both the territorial agreement and the preliminary marriage arrangement. "You have served our interests with exceptional skill," he told Takashi. "This agreement secures our immediate concerns while establishing foundation for long-term stability with our northern neighbor." "Thank you, my lord," Takashi replied with appropriate modesty. "The successful outcome reflects your clear guidance and Takeda's genuine interest in resolving tensions rather than escalating them." Lord Ishikawa nodded acknowledgement of this diplomatic attribution before turning unexpectedly to Mizuki. "And you, Tanaka-san, your contributions to this mission appear to have extended well beyond typical companion duties. The Maeda household clearly recognized your value in appointing you to Lady Haru's service." "I merely observed and reported what seemed potentially relevant," Mizuki replied, careful not to appear presumptuous, despite this direct acknowledgement from the clan lord himself. "An understatement according to Kuroda's account," Lord Ishikawa said with a hint of dry humor. "Effective observation and insightful interpretation are rare skills, particularly when applied with appropriate discretion." It was high praise from someone of his position, delivered with a directness that suggested genuine appreciation rather than merely ceremonial courtesy. Before Mizuki could formulate a suitably modest response, he continued with unexpected frankness. "The Maeda household's situation has changed significantly since Lady Haru's passing. While they have honored tradition by maintaining your position out of respect for her memory, such arrangements often fail to utilize capabilities that might better serve elsewhere." He glanced briefly at Takashi before returning his attention to Mizuki. "We may have opportunity to discuss more suitable arrangements in the near future, after the immediate matters of the Takeda agreement have been settled." With that cryptic but significant statement, Lord Ishikawa concluded the debriefing, issuing instructions for formal documentation of the agreement and preliminary correspondence regarding the potential marriage alliance. Takashi was directed to prepare detailed written reports, while arrangements were made for Mizuki's temporary accommodation within the Ishikawa compound rather than immediate return to the Maeda household. This unexpected development left Mizuki with mixed emotions as she was escorted to guest quarters set aside for her use. The acknowledgement of her contributions from Lord Ishikawa himself represented validation she had never anticipated when sitting alone at Akiko's wedding celebration days earlier. Yet the references to more suitable arrangements and separation from the Maeda household raised questions about her future that remained frustratingly unresolved. She had just finished settling into the modest but comfortable chamber provided for her when a servant announced Takashi's request to speak with her. She received him in the adjoining sitting room, curious what additional matters required discussion now that their formal debriefing had concluded. Takashi entered with the same calm assurance he had demonstrated throughout their mission, though Mizuki detected an unusual element of personal concern beneath his typically composed exterior. "I wanted to ensure you were comfortably situated," he began, "and to express my personal gratitude for your extraordinary contributions to our diplomatic efforts." The successful outcome owes much to your perceptiveness and insight. You've been more than generous in acknowledging my minor role, Mizuki replied, uncomfortable with such direct appreciation despite its evident sincerity. The diplomatic achievement is rightfully yours. This continued insistence on minimizing your contributions becomes less charming with repetition, Takashi observed with unexpected directness. False modesty may be socially appropriate in some contexts, but between us, after what we've accomplished together, it seems unnecessary pretense. The mild rebuke, delivered without rancor but with unmistakable frankness, startled Mizuki into momentary silence. Takashi took advantage of this pause to continue in a more personal tone than he had employed even during their private consultations at Takeda Castle. When I approached you at that wedding celebration, I did so with awareness of your capabilities from previous observation of your service to Lady Haru. But I could not have anticipated how perfectly our approaches would complement each other, nor how effective our partnership would prove in navigating complex diplomatic waters. The circumstances were unusual, Mizuki noted, struggling to maintain emotional distance despite the warmth his words evoked. Diplomatic missions create temporary alliances that wouldn't necessarily translate to other contexts. Unless those involved choose to make them more than temporary, Takashi countered, echoing his earlier comment during their return journey. Lord Ishikawa's reference to more suitable arrangements was not merely diplomatic courtesy. He has authorized me to discuss a specific proposal with you, though he felt formal presentation should wait until you had time to adjust to your return. Mizuki's pulse quickened at this confirmation that concrete plans were indeed being considered regarding her future role. What proposal? She asked directly, setting aside conventional indirection in favor of clear understanding. Takashi seemed pleased by her straightforward approach. Lord Ishikawa recognizes the value of your observational and analytical abilities, particularly as our clan enters this new phase of relations with both Takeda and, by extension, Abe interests. He proposes establishing a formal position for you within the Ishikawa household, ostensibly as attendant to Lady Ishikawa, but with specific responsibility for gathering and interpreting information relevant to these developing alliances. It was a remarkable offer, one that would provide legitimate purpose for capabilities that had previously operated only in the shadows of women's quarters. But Mizuki sensed there was more to this proposal than Takashi had yet revealed. And this position would be arranged with the Maeda family's agreement, she asked, considering practical implications. I remain technically in their service despite Lady Haru's passing. Lord Ishikawa has already discussed this matter with Lord Maeda, Takashi confirmed. Given your limited role in their household since Lady Haru's death, and the significant service you provided during our diplomatic mission, they have indicated willingness to release you from formal obligation if suitable arrangements are made. This rapid advancement of discussions regarding her future, without her direct participation, might have been offensive in other circumstances. But Mizuki recognized the practical realities of her position. As a woman without family connections, currently exercising direct authority over her placement, such negotiations would naturally occur between the household lords involved rather than with her personally. You said there was a specific proposal, she noted, returning to his earlier phrasing. This position you've described sounds like a general arrangement rather than something specific. Takashi hesitated briefly, an unusual sign of uncertainty from someone typically so composed. The specific aspect concerns who would serve as your direct connection to Lord Ishikawa himself, he said finally. Given our demonstrated effectiveness working together during the Takeda negotiations, he has suggested formalizing that partnership in a more permanent capacity, meaning meaning I would serve as your primary point of contact within the formal household structure, and you would report directly to me rather than through Lady Ishikawa or other intermediate channels. Takashi met her gaze directly. In essence, continuing the working relationship we established during our diplomatic mission, but within the context of ongoing household operations rather than a specific external assignment. It was a thoughtful arrangement that would maintain the productive dynamic they had developed while accommodating traditional household structures. Yet Mizuki sensed a personal element beneath the professional proposal. Something in Takashi's manner suggested this arrangement held meaning for him beyond merely efficient information management. "And you support this proposal?" she asked, watching his expression carefully. "I requested it," he admitted simply. "Our work together at Takeda Castle demonstrated complementary capabilities that produced results neither of us might have achieved independently. Continuing that partnership seems both practically advantageous and—" He paused, choosing his words with evident care, "personally satisfying." The admission of personal satisfaction alongside professional advantage represented a significant departure from the careful diplomatic language Takashi typically employed. It suggested depths to his interest in their continued association that extended beyond merely recognizing her usefulness to clan objectives. Before Mizuki could formulate a response to this unexpected revelation, Takashi continued with renewed formality, apparently concerned he had perhaps revealed too much of his personal inclinations. "Of course, the arrangement would be structured to ensure appropriate propriety and respect for your position. You would have independent authority within defined parameters, report directly to me regarding matters of diplomatic significance, and maintain ceremonial connection to Lady Ishikawa's household for traditional appearances." It was a return to practical considerations, stepping back from the brief glimpse of personal sentiment he had allowed to surface. Mizuki recognized the retreat and chose not to pursue the momentary vulnerability, instead engaging with the substantive proposal he had outlined. "It's a thoughtful arrangement," she acknowledged, "one that would provide meaningful purpose for capabilities that have been underutilized since Lady Haru's passing." "Then you'll consider it?" Takashi asked, a hint of what might have been relief coloring his typically measured tone. "I will," Mizuki confirmed, "though I would appreciate time to reflect before giving final answer. The change would be significant, not merely in household, but in fundamental purpose." "Of course." Takashi rose, resuming his more formal demeanor. "Lord Ishikawa anticipated you would want appropriate consideration time. He suggests you remain as honored guest for several days while the Takeda agreement is formalized, using that period to observe Ishikawa household operations and determine whether the proposed arrangement would suit your preferences." It was a generous approach, allowing her to assess the potential new position from direct observation rather than merely abstract description. Mizuki expressed appropriate gratitude for this consideration, and Takashi took his leave with formal courtesy that nevertheless carried undertones of personal investment in her eventual decision. Left alone, Mizuki found herself reflecting on the extraordinary transformation her circumstances had undergone in the span of just over a week. From isolated mourner at a wedding celebration to valued diplomatic partner to potential formal advisor within the Ishikawa household, it was a progression she could never have anticipated when Takashi first approached her with his unexpected invitation to "pretend like you're with me." That pretense had evolved into genuine partnership during their mission to Takeda Castle. Now it seemed poised to transform yet again into something more permanent, an arranged alliance of capabilities and perspectives that paralleled in some respects the diplomatic and marriage alliances they had helped negotiate between the great houses. The following days provided opportunity for Mizuki to observe Ishikawa household operations with the particular attention to dynamics and relationships that had proven so valuable during their diplomatic mission. She was treated with notable respect by household members at all levels. Takashi's evident appreciation for her contributions and Lord Ishikawa's direct acknowledgement of her role, having established her as someone worthy of serious consideration rather than merely a temporary visitor. Lady Ishikawa herself, a composed woman in her 50s, with considerable informal influence within the household, despite her traditionally limited formal authority, received Mizuki for private conversation on the third day of her stay. The meeting took place in the lady's personal chambers, where screens painted with mountain landscapes created an atmosphere of serene dignity appropriate to the matriarch's position. My husband speaks highly of your contributions to our recent diplomatic success. Lady Ishikawa began after preliminary courtesies had been exchanged. It is unusual for him to acknowledge such capabilities in someone outside our established advisors, particularly a woman previously unknown to our household. Lord Ishikawa is generous in his assessment, Mizuki replied with appropriate modesty. The successful outcome reflects primarily Kuroda-san's diplomatic skill and your husband's clear strategic vision. Lady Ishikawa smiled slightly. Diplomatic indeed, but false modesty serves neither of us at this juncture. Her direct approach, echoing Takashi's earlier comment about unnecessary pretense, suggested she shared her husband's practical focus on substance over ceremony when circumstances warranted. I understand you're considering formal position within our household, nominally under my authority, but with direct reporting relationship to Kuroda-san on matters of diplomatic intelligence. Yes, my lady. Lord Ishikawa has proposed such an arrangement. And what are your thoughts on this proposal? Not the carefully measured response you might offer officially, but your honest assessment of what such position would mean for you personally. It was a remarkably direct question from the household's senior woman, suggesting genuine interest in Mizuki's perspective, rather than merely ceremonial consultation before decisions made by others were implemented. Mizuki chose to respond with corresponding honesty rather than conventional deflection. It would provide purpose for abilities that have been underutilized since Lady Haru's passing, she said thoughtfully. The opportunity to contribute meaningfully to matters of consequence is appealing after months of existing primarily as reminder of loss rather than participant in present concerns. Lady Ishikawa nodded, apparently appreciating this candor. And the specific arrangement to work closely with Kuroda-san. I understand your partnership during the Takeda negotiations proved unexpectedly effective. There was a subtle emphasis on partnership that suggested Lady Ishikawa might perceive, or at least consider possible, dimensions to that relationship beyond merely professional collaboration. Mizuki chose her response carefully, acknowledging the productive working dynamic without addressing any potential personal implications. Kuroda-san demonstrated unusual willingness to value perspectives and insights that many in his position might dismiss or overlook, she said. Our approaches complemented each other effectively in understanding the complex dynamics at Takeda Castle. Indeed, Lady Ishikawa studied her thoughtfully. Takashi has always demonstrated greater appreciation for diverse perspectives than many of his peers. It's one reason my husband values him among our household's rising leaders. The use of Takashi's given name rather than family or title suggested both the lady's senior position and her personal familiarity with the younger man, perhaps even a somewhat maternal interest in his associations and development. Mizuki filed this observation away as potentially significant for understanding household dynamics if she accepted the proposed position. I should note, Lady Ishikawa continued after a moment, that while your formal placement would be within my household for propriety's sake, I have no intention of constraining your activities with unnecessary ceremonial obligations. Your value lies in your observational and analytical capabilities, not in traditional ladies' attendant functions. I appreciate that clarification, my lady. Good. Lady Ishikawa rose, signaling the conversation's conclusion. Consider carefully what this position would mean for your future. It represents significant change from your role with the Maeda household, more visible in some respects, with corresponding opportunities and challenges. As Mizuki prepared to take her leave, with appropriate acknowledgement of this advice, Lady Ishikawa added one final observation. Takashi seems to have developed considerable respect for your abilities during your time at Takeda Castle. That alone suggests you would find meaningful engagement in the role being proposed. With that somewhat cryptic comment, the interview concluded, leaving Mizuki with additional perspective on the household she was considering joining. Lady Ishikawa's practical approach and apparent support for the proposed arrangement represented significant advantage, given the importance of the matriarch's informal influence, even in households where formal authority remained primarily with male leadership. Later that same day, Mizuki encountered Takashi in one of the castle's smaller gardens, where she had gone to gather her thoughts in relative solitude. He appeared equally surprised by their chance meeting, having evidently sought similar respite from formal duties following completion of detailed documentation for the Takeda agreement. "Forgive my intrusion," he said, preparing to withdraw when he noticed her seated beside a small ornamental pond. "I didn't realize you were here." "No intrusion," Mizuki assured him. "The garden is certainly large enough to accommodate us both without disturbing each other's contemplation." He hesitated briefly before accepting this invitation to remain, settling on a stone bench positioned to enjoy view of both the pond and a carefully pruned maple tree just beginning to unfurl its spring leaves. "I understand you met with Lady Ishikawa today," he observed, after a comfortable silence had extended between them. "Yes. She was most gracious in discussing the proposed arrangement." "And did your conversation provide helpful perspective for your decision?" Mizuki considered how to characterize the meeting without revealing its more personal elements. She clarified that ceremonial obligations would not interfere with substantive responsibilities, which was reassuring. "My mother-in-law is remarkably practical in such matters," Takashi agreed. "She values results over appearances, though she maintains appropriate forms when circumstances require." This casual reference to family relationship startled Mizuki, who had not previously been aware of this connection. "Lady Ishikawa is your mother-in-law?" she asked, unable to conceal her surprise. Takashi's expression shifted to one of genuine dismay. "Forgive me. I assumed you were aware of my previous marriage. It was not my intention to reveal such personal history without proper context." "There's no need for apology," Mizuki assured him, though she found herself intensely curious about this unexpected dimension of his background. Family connections within great houses are naturally complex and not always immediately apparent to outsiders. Takashi seemed to debate internally whether to provide further explanation before evidently deciding that partial disclosure now required more complete context. "I was married to Lady Ishikawa's youngest daughter, Sakura, who died 3 years ago during a fever that swept through the region," he said quietly. "We had been wed less than 2 years when she fell ill." "I'm sorry for your loss," Mizuki replied with genuine sympathy, recognizing the grief that still colored his voice despite the passage of time. "Thank you." He gazed at the pond's surface, where koi moved in slow, graceful patterns beneath floating cherry blossoms. Our marriage had been arranged for traditional alliance purposes, but we had developed genuine affection despite the conventional nature of our match. This revelation cast their earlier interactions in somewhat different light. Takashi had experienced loss comparable to Mizuki's grief following Lady Haru's death, though of more intimate nature given the marital relationship. Perhaps this shared experience of mourning someone deeply valued explained some of his unusual perceptiveness regarding her emotional state when they first met at Akiko's wedding celebration. After Sakura's death, I immersed myself in service to Lord Ishikawa, Takashi continued after a moment. He and Lady Ishikawa had included me in their household through marriage, but chose to maintain that inclusion even after Sakura's passing, treating me as son rather than merely political connection. A testament to their regard for you, Mizuki observed, and perhaps to the strength of relationship you had developed beyond merely formal alliance. Yes, Takashi turned from the pond to look at her directly, which is why I understand something of what you experienced after Lady Haru's death, the continued formal acknowledgement of value while purpose and meaningful engagement gradually diminished, the difference being that I found renewed purpose through Lord Ishikawa's increasing trust, while I drifted without clear direction, Mizuki completed quietly. Until you appeared at that wedding and said, "Pretend like you're with me." The simple statement hung between them, carrying significance beyond the literal circumstances it referenced. In asking Mizuki to pretend connection for diplomatic convenience, Takashi had inadvertently created space for genuine partnership to develop, one that had proven valuable not merely for their specific mission, but potentially for both their futures. I don't regret that impulsive invitation, Takashi said after a moment, though I could hardly have anticipated where it would lead. Nor I, Mizuki acknowledged. When I agreed to your pretense, I expected perhaps an afternoon's diversion from isolation, not a diplomatic journey that would transform my understanding of my own capabilities. And now? Takashi asked, his tone carefully neutral despite evident interest in her response. Having experienced that transformation, what path do you see before you? It was a question that invited deeper reflection than merely whether she would accept the proposed position within the Ishikawa household. Mizuki considered carefully before responding, aware that her answer carried implications beyond immediate practical arrangements. I see possibility, she said finally, for using abilities that Lady Haru valued in service to new purposes, and for contributing to matters of consequence, rather than merely observing from isolation for... She hesitated briefly before continuing. For partnership, rather than merely service. The last phrase emerged with more personal significance than she had initially intended, revealing something of the emotional connection that had developed alongside their professional collaboration. Takashi seemed to recognize this deeper meaning, his expression shifting to one of cautious but evident hope. Partnership has proven remarkably effective between us, he observed, maintaining superficial focus on professional dimension while acknowledging the potential for broader interpretation. I would welcome continuation of that dynamic in whatever form proves most meaningful for both our purposes. It was a carefully calibrated statement that offered opening for deeper connection without presuming specific form or pressing for immediate definition. Mizuki appreciated both the sentiment itself and the thoughtful manner of its expression, characteristic of the measured approach that had made their work together so effective during the Takeda negotiations. I believe I will accept Lord Ishikawa's proposal, she said after a moment's reflection. The position offers opportunity to apply capabilities that might otherwise remain unused. in service to purposes that seem worthy of such application. "I'm glad," Takashi replied simply, though his expression conveyed more complex satisfaction than the words themselves might suggest. "The household will benefit greatly from your perspectives, as our diplomatic efforts already have." They sat in companionable silence for some time after this exchange, watching afternoon light play across the garden's carefully arranged elements. Neither felt immediate need to define further what their continued association might entail beyond the formal arrangement under discussion, yet both sensed foundations being established for possibilities that extended beyond merely professional collaboration. When they eventually parted, Takashi to attend Lord Ishikawa regarding final documentation for the Takeda Agreement, Mizuki to prepare formal response to the household position proposal, something had shifted subtly in their understanding of each other and the potential future they might share. The following morning, Mizuki formally accepted the position offered within the Ishikawa household, with arrangements to be finalized through appropriate communication with the Maeda family regarding her transfer from their service. Lord Ishikawa received her decision with evident satisfaction, issuing immediate instructions for suitable quarters to be prepared for her permanent residence rather than merely guest accommodation. As preparations proceeded for this significant transition, Mizuki found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with her isolated position at Akiko's wedding celebration. The pretense Takashi had proposed that day, "Pretend like you're with me," had created unexpected opening for genuine partnership to emerge, one that had proven valuable not merely for their diplomatic mission, but for discovering new purpose after profound loss. What had begun as momentary escape from isolation had evolved into opportunity for meaningful contribution. What had started as convenient fiction had developed into authentic connection, and what had initially appeared to be ending, her relevance following Lady Haru's death, had instead become beginning of entirely unexpected chapter in her life's journey. Sitting in the garden, where her conversation with Takashi had clarified both practical decision and personal possibility, Mizuki watched cherry blossoms drift across the ornamental pond's surface, much as they had during the wedding celebration where this transformation began. But now, instead of representing beauty observed in isolation, they seemed to embody the transient yet perfect moments that occasionally open pathways to entirely new directions. She was no longer alone at life's celebrations and transitions. Through unexpected invitation to pretend, she had discovered genuine place where her abilities, perspectives, and presence were valued, not merely tolerated. The samurai, who had offered temporary escape from isolation, had inadvertently created opening for lasting purpose, and perhaps, in time, for connection deeper than either could have imagined when this journey began.